Part 4, The United Nations. The devil has recovered his citizenship rights in the Republic of Culture. Giovanni Papini. Publicity flared to its maximum coverage when it was announced, in the summer of 1965, that Pope Paul would visit New York later that year in order to address the United Nations Assembly. It was heralded as an event of the utmost importance that would surely bring results that could not be lost upon the world. But there was also some speculation as to why non-Catholic, and even anti-Catholic quarters, were giving rise to much the same bursts of excitement that had marked the election of John XXIII. Could it be that the same power was pulling wires, behind the scenes, to influence the tone of the press, radio, and television? We have already assessed, to some extent, the character and the leanings of Paul VI. Let us now glance at the formation and the makeup of the United Nations. It was primarily communist in tone, its charter, signed in 1943, being based upon the Constitution of Soviet Russia, while its purpose and principles were decided at a conference of foreign ministers held in Moscow. The secretaries of the United Nations Security Council, between the years 1946 and 1962, were Arkady Sobolov and Eugenie Kiselev, both communists. A leading figure of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, was Vladimir Malmovsky, communist. The chief secretary for UNESCO was Madame Jegelova, communist, while the president, vice president, and 9 judges of the World Court were all communists. Yet these were typical of the people on whom Paul VI lavished praise, and to whom he looked for the salvation of the world, while the press and radio, subject to the same international control as the United Nations, continues to speak of that body as being worthy of respect. Posing as strictly neutral, and with the declared intention of promoting world peace, it soon showed a definite bias in favor of communist-inspired guerrilla movements whose object, in several parts of the world, was the overthrow of established governments. This was done under the guise of liberating people from oppression, but the ultimate design of the assembly, then as now, was to set up a totalitarian system in which national sovereignty and cultures would disappear. Incidental to this, as was made plain by the secondary social and economic organizations that sprang from the assembly, would be a virtual censorship, whose voice was predominantly atheist. For it had been noted that the more orthodox countries such as Italy, Austria, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, were excluded from the Assembly's original foundation, whereas Bolshevist Russia, from its permanent seat on the Security Council, possessed a veto that could reduce the decisions of the Assembly to a mere expression of words, without effect, a judgment that may fairly be passed on all the deliberations of the United Nations from the day of its founding to the present. More concrete evidence for these strictures may be adduced when we look at the record of a professional criminal who came to occupy a leading place, by way of the United Nations, in European life. He was Mir Jenik Moisevich Valak, or Wallach, who, before the 1914 war, emerged from the stormy background of Russian political life as a wanted figure who found it safer, and more rewarding, to extend his activities to countries that were, so far, less disturbed. Working under a variety of names, including Bookman, Maxim Harrison, Ludwig Nies, David Mordecai, and Finkelstein, he came into the limelight in Paris in 1908, when he took a hand in robbing the Tiflis Bank of 250,000 rubles. He was deported, but soon afterwards was in trouble again for dealing in stolen banknotes. His chance came in 1917, when the Russian Revolution brought him and his kind to the surface. Now, under the respectable pseudonym of Maxim Litvinov, he became Soviet Commissioner for Foreign Affairs. His next step was to the presidency of the Council of the League of Nations. He then arrived in London as Soviet ambassador to the court of St. James, and as such became a familiar and influential figure in royal and diplomatic circles. As further evidence of the downward slide in our public and political affairs, it may be noted that the first Secretary General of the United Nations was Alger Hiss, who had been convicted of perjury in the American courts. He took a prominent part in shaping the United Nations Charter on Russian communist lines. These considerations, however, did not weigh heavily with the faithful, who thought that the Pope's address and appearance, before a world audience, would be a golden opportunity for the advancement of papal teaching. It would burst upon the doubting and insecure world with a certainty that it had never before experienced. Many listeners, for the first time in their lives, would be brought face to face with the reality of religion. It was only the Church that had anything really important to say, that could add spiritual significance to the routine of daily life. Some half a century before, Pius X had issued directions and indicated guidelines that were everywhere and at all times relevant. But his audience had been as necessarily limited as his means to make himself heard. Now it was for Pope Paul to echo the words of his predecessor, but this time to an almost universal congregation that could be reached through the medium of the United Nations. Pius had said, "There is no need for me to point out that the advent of world democracy can have no relevancy to the work of the Church in the world. The reform of civilization is essentially a religious task, for true civilization presupposes a moral foundation, and there can be no morally based foundation without true religion. This is a truth which can be demonstrated from the evidence of history." But Pope Paul had no intention of endorsing what Pius had said. For instead of a religious leader speaking on October 4, 1965, it might have been a disciple of Jean-Jacques Rousseau holding forth on the deification of human nature that, finding expression in the Declaration of the Rights of Man on August 12, 1789, ushered in the French Revolution. The rights of man, that were enthusiastically defined as being vested in liberty, equality, and fraternity, led to the cult of man and man's elevation in place of God, from which it followed that all religious forms, and institutions such as rulership, family life, and the holding of private property, were denigrated as being parts of the old order that was on the point of passing. When the effects of the Second Vatican Council became apparent, Dr. Rudolf Gruber, Bishop of Regensburg, was led to observe that the main ideas of the French Revolution, which represents an important element in Lucifer's plan, were being adopted in many spheres of Catholicism. And Pope Paul, speaking direct to a battery of microphones that carried to the world, gave ample evidence of this. He made no reference to spiritual claims or the importance of religion. Behold the day we have awaited for centuries. This is the ideal that mankind has dreamt of in its journey through history. We would venture to call it the world's greatest hope. It is your task here, he told the members of the assembly, to proclaim the basic rights and duties of man. We are conscious that you are the interpreters of all that is permanent in human wisdom, we could almost say of its sacred character. Man had now come of age, and was qualified to live by a philosophic morality that, owing nothing to authority, was created by himself. The United Nations, destined to play the leading role in the world, was the last hope of mankind. So it was to secular structures that man must look for the stability and redemption of humanity, in a word, to himself, sentiments that would not have been out of place in the committee rooms of the French Revolution, sentiments that no one would have thought to hear expressed by a pope, void as they were of any reference to the claims and traditional message of the Church. That this was understood and appreciated was shown by the reception accorded him at the close of his address, by those of a certain political persuasion who made up by far the greater part of his live audience. He was surrounded by backslapping and handshaking representatives of Russia, China, and the Soviet satellite states. He arranged for further meetings, which proved to be four in all, with the Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko, real name Katz, and his wife. There were congratulations from Nikolai Podgorny, member of the Politburo, and warm exchanges with Arthur Goldberg, a prominent member of the Communist Party. Pope Paul had opened up the world of religion to its old and inveterate enemies, the champions of social reform who denied revelation. Dialogue was now much in fashion, and the prospect of Moscow and the Vatican entering into talks was taken for granted. The world's leading churchmen had propagated the social gospel, so dear to the heart of revolutionaries, without a single reference to the religious doctrines that they found pernicious. Differences between the two sides were not so deep-seated and final as had once been thought. The Pope, and those who clustered about him sometimes with two-handed clasps, could henceforth be allies. It now remained to round off a truly historic visit with an initiatory rite that would put the seal on this newly admitted realization. Behold, thy king is coming to thee, humbly riding on an ass. So wrote St. Matthew, 21.5, on Christ's entry into Jerusalem. But it was not thus that Christ's representative rode along Broadway. Pope Paul traveled in a 7-passenger Lincoln convertible, through a forest of flags and bunting, with a police escort on motorcycles, and thousands more police lining the way and restraining crowds that were uncertain whether to stand, kneel, or bow their heads in expectation of a blessing, and whether to wave or raise an arm in salute, with 2 spotter helicopters buzzing and circling overhead, sirens blowing, and on nearly every building fluorescent lighting that unnecessarily vied with the daylight, and the United Nations Plaza building spelling out welcome, Pope Paul VI. This followed upon a question that Cardinal Vagnozzi, the apostolic delegate in New York, put to Pope Paul. What was to be the next goal of his visit? The meditation room in the United Nations building, Paul told him. The cardinal was surprised, shocked. He had good reason for affirming that the Holy Father couldn't go there. But he went. The room, with 2 others of its kind, one at Wainwright House, Stuyvesant Avenue, Rye, New York, and the other in the United States Capitol, represented the early stage of a scheme the fulfillment of which would be marked, in concrete form, by the erection of what was called the Temple of Understanding, on 50 acres of ground along the banks of the Potomac in Washington, D.C. It was part of a design to form one interreligious world body on the part of a certain Mrs. Judith Dickerman Hollister, who revealed an anti-traditional, pro-mysterious bias by becoming a Shinto. As such, she believed the Japanese myth that 2 divine universal parents descended upon an island that was made of drops of salt. There the godmother gave birth to other islands, with mountains and rivers, and finally to a whole galaxy of gods. After that astonishing feat the lady withdrew from her sea-girt home and was seen no more. Thus armed with an air of mystery, a suggestion of interior enlightenment, and an eccentric bearing, Mrs. Hollister found an enthusiastic supporter in the President's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, whom some of her intimates rated as being somewhat below the mentally normal. From that it needed but a step to secure the backing of the United States government, while John D. Rockefeller, and several of his associates in the Communist Front that he founded, contributed to what was called the Spiritual United Nations. Another pro-communist millionaire, Marshall Field, who has already been noted as a patron of the anarchist Saul David Alinsky, helped to pay for the decoration of the room. The Ford Foundation also gave financial encouragement. A carefully edited bulletin, that supposedly dealt with the meaning and purpose of the room, was produced by the Lucy's Press, which issues printed matter for the United Nations. The suspicious may find food for thought in the fact that this publishing company, when it started in the early part of this century, was known as the Lucifer Press. It now functions at 3 Whitehall Court, London, S.W.1. That title might well have been retained when dealing with Mrs. Hollister's creation, for the room, and this explains the shock felt by Cardinal Vagnozzi, was a center of the Illuminati, given over to the cult of the all-seeing eye that under a system of allegories and veiled secrets, as translated by the Masters of Wisdom, was dedicated to the service of pagan cults, and the obliteration of Christian in favor of humanistic beliefs. 2 doors, each fitted with tinted glass panels, lead into the room. A guard stands outside, and another is stationed just inside the door. The entrant encounters semi-darkness, and a quiet into which one's footsteps are absorbed by a thick blue rug on the floor. An arched inner way, still overhung by a sense of night-like stillness, opens out into a space some 30 feet long, wedge-shaped, windowless, and with a solitary yellow light, apparently beamed from nowhere, shimmering on the surface of an altar that stands in the center, a waist-high block of crystalline iron ore that is known to weigh between 6 and 7 tons. Blue rugs are spread over the floor, that is elsewhere paved with blue-gray lengths of slate. At the far end of the room, where the dimness melts into total shadow, there is a low railing beyond which only the privileged are allowed to pass. The fresco mural, more than 8 feet high and some 2 feet smaller in width, is played upon by a light directed from the top. Framed in a steel panel, it appears to be an apparently meaningless cluster of blue, gray, white, brown, and yellow geometrical designs. But to those versed in esoteric understanding, the crescents and triangles present a definite form that takes shape in the center. An outer circle of the mural, as the Illuminati eye. Main attention is not, however, focused upon the mural but on the altar, that is dedicated to the Faceless One, and from which an air of brooding mystery, prevalent in the room, appears to radiate. And as one's senses respond, it is realized that other shaded lights, concealed in a suspended ceiling that matches the size of the room, add to the somber impression conveyed by the altar beam. Pope Paul, at the end of his mission, was presented with a model of the then prospective Temple of Understanding. The Masters extended a similar welcome to Cardinal Swinens, who later visited the meditation room, and in return representatives of the temple were received at the Vatican. The underlying purpose of the temple was plainly revealed by its plan, with the all-seeing eye, faceted like a diamond in the central dome of the building, reflecting the rays of the sun through wings that represented 6 world faiths: Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Confucianism, and Christianity. The same symbolism figured at a banquet attended by some 500 supporters of syncretism at the Waldorf Astor, where a little scene was enacted. When a child, holding aloft the model of an egg, was presented to the president of the temple, the same Mrs. Dickerman Hollister. She tapped the egg with a wand, and the shell dropped away to reveal a tree with 6 golden branches. Before leaving America, Pope Paul, to press home his voluntary renunciation of spiritual authority, made a show of divesting himself of the Church's reminders and insignia. He gave the papal ring of diamonds and rubies, and his pectoral cross of diamonds and emeralds, the two containing 404 diamonds, 145 emeralds, and 20 rubies, to the Buddhist youth and then Secretary General of the United Nations. A jeweler had estimated that the jewels alone, apart from their traditional value, were worth more than $100,000. They were swept up at an auction for $64,000, after which the successful buyer sold them to a Mr. David Morton of Orono, Minnesota. Some items of this papal jewelry were next seen decking the person of a female performer who appeared in the Carson television night show. The ring and the cross continued to go the round of dealers, auction rooms, and superior junk shops, and were last heard of among the articles offered for sale at a market in Geneva. This abnegation followed Pope Paul's public show of giving up the tiara, the triple crown that denotes the Trinity, the authority and the spiritual powers of the Church. The crown was presented to a pope at the time of his coronation with the words, "Receive this tiara adorned with 3 crowns and know that you are the Father of princes and of kings, guide of the world, and vicar upon earth of Jesus Christ." Pope Paul let it be known that he was giving up the crown for the benefit of the poor of the world, a motive that was played up by the press and that went down well with the public. But he was giving up something that had never been his, in the first place, and so was not transferable. Moreover, one word from him would have caused all the worldwide missions and charitable organizations of the Church to open their purses for the poor. But instead, he made a theatrical gesture by discarding external signs of religious dignity which, as he and his kind well knew, was a minor step that, added to others of its kind, was part of the process of sapping the Church's internal significance. He also made use of a sinister symbol, used by Satanists in the 6th century, that had been revived at the time of Vatican II. This was a bent or broken cross on which was displayed a repulsive and distorted figure of Christ, which the black magicians and sorcerers of the Middle Ages had made use of to represent the biblical term, mark of the beast. Yet not only Paul VI but his successors, the 2 John Pauls, carried that object and held it up to be revered by crowds who had not the slightest idea that it stood for Antichrist. Furthermore, this exhibition of a desiccated figure on a twisted stick was forbidden by Canon 1279, which condemned the usage of any sacred image that is not in keeping with the approved usage of the Church. That it was used for occult purposes may be seen in woodcuts shown in the Museum of Witchcraft in Bayonne, France. Another disquieting feature of Pope Paul's visit to the United States was his appearance at the Yankee Stadium in New York, wearing the ephod, the ancient garment with breastplate of 12 stones, representing the 12 sons of Jacob, as worn by Caiaphas, the high priest of the Sanhedrin, who called for the crucifixion of Christ. As though not content with that quite unnecessary innovation, His Holiness continued to wear that non-Christian symbol on other occasions, including the Way of the Cross procession in Rome on March 27, 1964, at a ceremony in the Place dei Spigni, Rome, on December 8, 1964, the visit of Dr. Ramsay, Archbishop of Canterbury, to the Vatican in 1966, at a reception of parish priests in the Sistine Chapel, and at Castel Gandolfo in the summer of 1970. The tone of Pope Paul's address to the United Nations had given no little encouragement to the progressives, or left-wing element, within the Church. 4. Within a few days of Paul's return to Rome, the Bishop of Cuernavaca, Mendes Arcio, was declaring that Marxism is necessary in order to realize God's kingdom at the present time, while Pope Paul let it be known that Rome, in order to end an old enmity, was ready to take a new look at secret societies. As part of that process, Monsignor Pezzaril was entrusted with the task of negotiating with the governing body of those societies with a view to establishing friendly contact. The retentive powers of those who write for the papers, like the memories of those who seriously regard them, are proverbially short. Yet because the Pope's speech in New York was well in keeping with the prevailing trend, it is not surprising to find that the cue he had given there was taken up, some time later, by the Vatican journal L'Osservatore Romano, which let it be known that the Church's traditional message had yielded place to a more unorthodox concept, by announcing, "There are no true riches but man." Addendum, notes regarding the UN mediation room. According to a report in the New Hampshire Sunday Times News hashtag dated October 21, 1962, the mural in the UN meditation room contains numerous triangles and pyramids to represent the deity in accordance with ancient Babylonian symbolism. It also includes a spiral intertwined with a diagonal line to represent the wand of Hermes, the caduceus, along with a central sphere and outer circle to represent the Eye of Horus or the all-seeing eye of Masonry. The only other object in the room is a 6.5-ton rectangular block of iron ore, polished on top and illuminated from above by a single spotlight. When the meditation room was opened in 1957, Secretary General of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, directed that the following text be distributed to visitors. "We all have within us a center of stillness surrounded by silence. People of many faiths will meet here. There are simple things which speak to us all with the same language. We have sought for such things and we believe that we have found them in the shaft of light striking the shimmering surface of solid rock. So, in the middle of the room we see a symbol of how, daily, the light of the skies gives life to the earth on which we stand, a symbol to many of us of how the light of the Spirit gives life to matter. But the stone in the middle of the room has more to tell us. We may see it as an altar, empty not because there is no God, not because it is an altar to an unknown God, but because it is dedicated to the God whom man worships under many names and in many forms. The material of the stone leads our thoughts to the necessity for choice between destruction and construction, between war and peace. Of iron man has forged his swords, of iron he has also made his plowshares. Of iron he has constructed tanks, but of iron he has likewise built homes for man. The block of iron ore is part of the wealth we have inherited on this earth of ours. How are we to use it? This is profoundly New Age and Masonic. The stillness surrounded by silence, which he says constitutes the center of each person, is a core principle of New Age meditation which is designed to liberate the God within. Masons have long proclaimed that all faiths are one, a sentiment which is strongly expressed in this UN declaration. It is dedicated to the God whom man worships under many names and in many forms. Masons also emphasize the shaft of light which is meant to enter the neophyte at the time of initiation and to become stronger as he advances into each higher degree of initiation. Most remarkable of all is the description of the solid iron altar as rock or stone. Only towards the end does it acknowledge that The altar is actually made of iron. This ambiguity or conflation is a deliberate occult device, where a concept is merged with its opposite to produce a higher truth. It also an outrageous affront to the God of the Bible, who stated that no iron could be incorporated into any part of his temple in Jerusalem. The Bible associates iron with man's rebellion against God, notably that of Cain and his warlike descendants, Tubal-Cain, who is revered by the Masons, and the great Antichrist figure, Nimrod, who is sacred to the Illuminati. The text reinforces this with a reference to this earth of ours, implying that it no longer belongs to God. The UN text shows very clearly that the meditation room is a shrine in honor of man's rebellion against God and a celebration of the Illuminati light bringer. Part 5, Freemasons in the Clergy. The veil covering the greatest deceit ever to have mystified the clergy and baffled the faithful, is doubtless beginning to be torn asunder. Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, an observer of the Roman scene, Georges Vierbeau, tells how a feeling of surprise, that was near consternation, spread through the Vatican one morning in 1976. Students in their cassocks, colored purple, violet, or black, according to their nationality, stood about in groups, discussing the latest number of a journal, the Borghese. Some, the writer says, were actually perspiring with alarm, for although the morning was hot, the atmosphere engendered by what they read affected them more than the weather. For the paper contained a detailed list of clerics, some holding the most exalted offices, who were said to be members of secret societies. It was staggering news, for the doubtful head-shaking students were acquainted with church law, and Canon Law 2335 expressly declared that a Catholic who joined any such society became excommunicate, ipso facto. We have seen that the secret societies had, long ago, declared war on the Church, which they recognized as the one great obstacle barring their way to world domination, and the Church responded by condemning the societies and making laws for her own protection. Canon 2335 was framed for that purpose, while Canon 2336 was concerned with disciplinary measures to be enforced against any cleric who might be inveigled into joining a society. In the case of a bishop, he would lose all juridical powers, and be barred from exercising priestly functions including ordination and consecrating. That the Church considered the societies to be a most dangerous threat to its own existence is shown by the number of warnings and condemnations issued by the Vatican. What is usually regarded as the first official instance of this occurred under Pope Clement XII, 1730-40, which stressed that belonging to any such society was incompatible with membership of the Church. 11 years later, Benedict XIV confirmed this in the first papal bull directed against the societies. Pius VI and Pius VII followed suit, the last named being specially concerned with the threat posed by the Carbonari. 3 subsequent popes, Leo XII, Pius VIII, and Gregory VI, added their weight to the strictures. A further condemnation came from Pius IX, who, incidentally, had to face the charge that he had descended from the counts of Mastiferity, who had almost certainly been involved with the societies. Leo XIII spoke of the plotters aiming to destroy from top to bottom the whole religious and social discipline born of Christian institutions, and to replace belief in the supernatural spirit by a sort of second-hand naturalism. Just as the writings of Voltaire, Diderot, and Helvetius had opened up the way for the French Revolution, so the secret societies, said Pius X, 1903-14, were working to destroy Catholicism in modern France. So paramount was the danger to Benedict XV that not even the cares imposed by the 1914 war could drive it finally from his mind, while Pius XI reiterated that the secret societies derived much of their strength from the conspiracy of silence that has never ceased to surround them. Although conducted largely behind the scenes, and therefore away from the public gaze, the struggle between the Church and the secret societies has been more bitter and prolonged than any international conflict, the reason being that it has turned, in great part, on ideas, on a mental and therefore a moral basis, and, although not universally recognized, the moral outlook influences the whole nature of man more than any conflict for personal gain, territory, or positive power. On one side was a religion that, its supporters claimed, rested on facts, the objective value of revealed truth, and a sacramental observance. On the other, a system grounded in humanitarian ideals in which all men, freed from the shackles or dogma and orthodoxy, could share, and on which they could agree. Truth, they said, is relative, hence the claims of objective and revealed truth are seen to be not only valueless, but fundamentally false. So the struggle developed over the centuries, with those who accepted the atheism, positivism, or materialism that reached its summit with the French Revolution, on one side, and the strictures uttered by various popes, from Clement XII in the mid-18th century to Pius XI who died in 1939, on the other. The least condemnatory of those strictures referred to the societies as conspiracies of silence. The most damning called them synagogues of Satan. But not all their members regarded the satanic connection as a stigma. This is how one of their principal archivists, Albert Lantoine, went out of his way to address Pius XII in August, 1943. I am pleased to say that we, possessed of a critical spirit, are servants of Satan. You defend truth, and are servants of God. The two masters complete each other, and need each other. You would exterminate us. Be careful. The death of Satan will mark the agony of your God. You must accept the alliance with Satan, and admit that he completes God. The news in the Borghese, that so alarmed the students, came as the culmination of a fear that had lingered for some time among the more conservative elements in the Vatican. The exposure of Archbishop Bugnani, at the time of the Second Vatican Council, had been shattering enough. But the revelations in the Borghese were on a more considerable scale, and came perilously near to touching the very nerve of the Church. It was known that enemy agents had long been nibbling at its fabric. But so long as Church discipline remained strong, it was difficult for the most ardent infiltrator to gain a footing in the priesthood. But the general relaxation and reforms that followed Pope John's council opened doors by which agents entered not only seminaries but the curia, the governing body of the Church. Because some of those agents rose high in the Church, and became cardinals and bishops, many who might otherwise have been suspicious were deceived. The ecclesiastical titles, and the offices that went with them, were thought to be sufficient, though they were really only outward safeguard. The hands of the manipulators were raised in blessing, and the faithful knelt. The warnings against them that were issued went largely unheeded or fell stone dead against the historically impressive walls that bounded the Church. A fifth column exists within the clergy, wrote Father Arapi, Superior General of the Jesuits, and is steadily working in favor of atheism. A similar theme was expressed by a number of theologians who came together in Geneva in 1976, as an International Committee of Defense of Catholic Doctrine. The presence of the enemies of the Church, in the internal structure of the Church, forms a part of the mystery of iniquity and should be unmasked. But so far those fears had taken no more tangible shape than to unsettle the minds of students, who felt their future might be disturbed by the revelations that produced little or no effect among their superiors and instructors in the Vatican. The usual inquiry was ordered, by some of the churchmen who had been named as guilty, with the declared object of tracing the source of the rumors. But nothing happened, and neither did one of those who had been implicated ever issue a downright or straightforward denial. The Borghese article claimed to have a detailed list of conspirators who had penetrated into the church, together with dates, numbers, and code names. These allegations were answered by a writer in El Aurora, M. Jacques Plancard, who asserted that no prelate had been affiliated with a secret society since the time of Charles X, the last of the Bourbons who ascended the throne in 1824, and was driven out by the Revolution of 1830. This was palpably false, as was proved by determined investigators who carried the attack into enemy territory. By one means or another, sometimes posing as members of the government, they gained access to the Italian register of secret societies, and drew up a much longer and more impressive list than that published in the Borghese. The particulars that follow are those of cardinals, archbishops, and bishops, who, as alleged by those who examined it, figure in the register. Some have died since the list was drawn up. At one time it was said to have included 125 prelates. Some of the offices have changed hands, but the names and ecclesiastical titles, with the dates on which they were initiated into a society, and their secret code names, must call for serious consideration, except from those Catholics who blindly follow the rules, who hang upon the words of a priest, and who think it part of their faith to see no stain upon the Church. It may be noted that the code name often incorporates the first two letters of the cleric's name. Agostino, Cardinal Ciceroli, Secretary of State, Prefect of the Sacred Congregation of Public Affairs, and of the Sacred Congregation of Bishops, and of the Pontifical Commission for the Revision of Canon Law, member of the Commission for Russia and of the Commission for Latin America. The most influential prelate in the Vatican after the Pope, whose place he takes during the absence of the latter. He is known as the Kissinger of Vatican diplomacy. Initiated into a secret society September 28, 1957. Secret code name Casa. Leon Joseph, Cardinal Swinans, Primate of Belgium. Member of the Pontifical Commission for the Revision of Canon Law. Was active in the Sacred Congregation of Propaganda Fide, the Sacred Congregation of Rites and Ceremonies, and the Sacred Congregation of Seminaries and University Studies. He was a delegate and moderator of the Second Vatican Council, and he has been associated with Protestant Pentecostalism, that reduces people to revivalist hysteria. Initiated June 15, 1967. Code name Lisieux. Jean, Cardinal Villot. He was Secretary of State to Paul VI, and Camerlengo, the Chamberlain who takes over affairs at the Vatican on the death of a pope. Prefect of the Sacred Congregation for Religious and Secular Institutes, and Administrator of the Patrimony of the Holy See. He came of a family which has produced over the last 200 years, from father to son, Grand Masters of secret societies including the Rosicrucians. Being aware that this had become known, he strenuously denied that he was associated in any way with such societies. One of his denials was contained in a letter, dated October 31, 1976, sent from the Vatican by way of the Papal Nunciature in Paris, to the Director of Lectures Françaises, a monthly publication. It ran: having noticed that in your review of September 1976, you referred to Cardinal Villot as a member of a secret society, Cardinal Villot declares in the most formal fashion that he has never had, at any moment in his life, the least connection with any secret society. He adheres closely to the condemnations imposed by the sovereign pontiffs. Cardinal Villot begs the Director of Lectures Françaises to publish this denial in a future issue, and thanks him in advance. One cannot help wondering how Cardinal Villot, who appears to have been afflicted with an unusually short memory, managed to fulfill his office as Secretary of State. For records show that he was initiated into a secret society on August 6, 1966, and that in the hope of avoiding identification he was given two code names, Jeannie and Zirigo. Achille, Cardinal Léonard, Bishop of Lille. He was formerly a captain in the French army, and a lifelong ultra-liberal. He led the progressive forces at the Second Vatican Council, on which account it was said that his ideas were redder than his robes. Shortly before his death he startled those in the room by suddenly exclaiming, "Humanly speaking, the Church is dead." Initiated October 15, 1912. Code name could not be verified. Ugo, Cardinal Poletti, Vicar General of the Diocese of Rome, and so Controller of all the clergy in the city. Member of the Sacred Congregation of Sacraments and of Divine Worship. President of Pontifical Works, and of the Liturgical Academy. Archpriest of the Patriarchal Basilica of the Lateran. Initiated February 17, 1969. Code name Apo. Franco, Cardinal Biffi. Head of the St. John Lateran Pontifical University. Initiated August 15, 1969. Code name Biffra. Michel, Cardinal Pellegrino, Archbishop of Turin, where the Holy Shroud is kept. Initiated May 2, 1960. Code name Pomai. Sebastiano, Cardinal Baggio, Prefect of the Sacred Congregation of Bishops. Initiated August 15, 1957. Code name Saba. Pascal, Cardinal Macchi, Prelate of Honor and Secretary to Paul VI. After being excommunicated for heresy, he was reinstated by Cardinal Villot. Initiated April 23, 1958. Code name Mappa. Salvatore, Cardinal Pappalardo, Archbishop of Palermo, Sicily. Initiated May 6, 1943. Code name Salpo. Cardinal Garone, Prefect of the Congregation for Catholic Education. He brazenly let it be known that he was a member of a secret society, but he was neither removed nor publicly reproved. Date of initiation and code name could not be verified. Archbishop Annibale Bugnani, consultant in the Sacred Congregation of Propagation of the Faith, and in the Sacred Congregation of Holy Rites. The story of his unmasking during the Second Vatican Council has been told. Died July 3, 1982. Initiated April 23, 1963. Code name Buin. Archbishop Giovanni Benelli, Archbishop of Florence. He secured the appointment of Cardinal Villot as Secretary of State in place of the Orthodox Cardinal Cicognani. Date of initiation and code name could not be verified. Archbishop Mario Brini, Consultor of the Pontifical Commission for the Revision of Canon Law, Secretary of the Sacred Congregation for Eastern Churches, and a member of the Pontifical Commission for Russia. Initiated July 13, 1969. Codename Mabry. Bishop Michel Burrow. Prelate of the Pontifical Commission to Latin America. Initiated March 21, 1969. Codename Bumi. Bishop Fiorenzo Angelini. Titular Bishop of Messine, Greece. Delegate of the Cardinal Vicar of Rome for Hospitals. Initiated October 14, 1957. Code name could not be verified. Monsignor Mario Rizzi. Prelate of Honor to the Holy Father. He was responsible for discarding certain canon laws which formed part of the foundation of the Church from apostolic times. Initiated September 16, 1969. Code name Mari or Monmary. Monsignor Pio Vito Pinto. Attaché of Secretary of State, and Notary of the Second Section of the Supreme Tribunal and of the Apostolic Senatura. He is listed as a very important person among the societies. Initiated April 2, 1970. Code name Pimpy. Monsignor Francesco Marchisano. Prelate of Honor to the Holy Father. Secretary of the Congregation for Catholic Education. Initiated February 14, 1961. Code name Firma. Aurelio Sabatani. Archbishop of Giustiniana, Milan Province, Italy. First Secretary of the Supreme Apostolic Senatura. Initiated June 22, 1969. Code name Asa. Abino Mensa. Archbishop of Vercelli, Piedmont, Italy. Initiated July 23, 1969. Code name Mina. Enzio D'Antonio. Archbishop of Triventino. Initiated June 21, 1969. Code name could not be verified. Alessandro Gherardi. Archbishop of Trento, Italy. He controls candidates who are likely to be raised to the dignity of cardinal. He is addressed as Doctor at secret society meetings. Initiated June 13, 1959. Code name Algo. Antonio Travia. Titular Bishop of Termini Imerese. He is the head of Catholic schools. Initiated September 15, 1967. Code name Atra. Giuseppe Mario Sensi. Titular Bishop of Sardi, Asia Minor. Papal Nuncio to Portugal. Initiated November 2, 1967. Code name Gimas. Francesco Salerno. Bishop Prefect. Initiated May 4, 1962. Code name Safra. Antonio Mazza. Titular Bishop of Velia. Initiated April 14, 1971. Code name Manu. Mario Schierano. Titular Bishop of Acrita, Cosenza Province, Italy. Chief Military Chaplain of the Italian Armed Forces. Initiated July 3, 1959. Code name Masket. Luigi Maverna. Bishop of Chiavari, Genoa, Italy. Initiated June 3, 1968. Code name Luma. Aldo Del Monte. Bishop of Novara, Piedmont, Italy. Initiated August 25, 1969. Code name Idilmo. Marcello Morgantat. Bishop of Ascoli, Puno, in East Italy. Initiated July 22, 1955. Code name Morma. Luigi Bedizzi. Bishop of Lyria, Italy. Initiated May LLTH, 1966. Code name Lube. Gaetano Bonicelli. Bishop of Albano, Italy. Initiated May 12, 1959. Code name Boga. Salvatore Baldassarre, Bishop of Ravenna, Italy. Initiated February 17, 1958. Code name Balsa. Vito Gemiti, member of the Sacred Congregation of Bishops. Initiated March 25, 1968. Code name Vach. Pierluigi Mazzoni, member of the Sacred Congregation of Bishops. Initiated September 14, 1959. Code name Pilum. Ecobedo Bossidana, prelate of Milan. Initiated September 14, 1963. Code name Base. Mario Bicarelli, prelate of Vicenza, Italy. Initiated September 23, 1964. Code name Bima. Salvatore Marsili, abbot of the Order of Saint Benedict of Finalpia, near Medina, Italy. Initiated July 2, 1963. Code name Salma. Annibale Ilari, abbot of Sua Santita. Initiated March 16, 1969. Code name Isla. Franco Guildrini, rector of Capri. Initiated May 22, 1961. Code name Grifra. Lino Lazza, Chancellor of the Rome Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas. Initiated July 23, 1969. Code name Loli. Damicio Mongelo, Professor of Dominican Moral Theology, Holy Angels Institute, Rome. Initiated February 16, 1969. Code name Monda. Flaminio Cerruti, Chief of the Office of University of Congregation Studies. Initiated April 2, 1960. Enrico Chiavaxi, Professor of Morals at the University of Florence. Initiated July 2, 1970. Code name Giat. Carmelo Negro, Rector of the Seminary Pontifical of Major Studies. Initiated December 21, 1970. Code name Carni. Carlo Graziani, Rector of the Minor Seminary of the Vatican. Initiated July 23, 1961. Code name Gracca. Luigi Belloli, Rector of the Lombardy Seminary. Initiated April 6, 1958. Code name Bella. Virgilio No, Head of the Sacred Congregation of Divine Worship. Initiated April 3, 1961. Code name Vino. Dino Monduzzi, Regent to the Prefect of the Pontifical House. Initiated March LLTH, 1967. Code name Mondi. Vittorio Palestra, Legal Counsel to the Sacred Rota of the Vatican State. Initiated May 6, 1943. Code name Pavi. Giuseppe Ferraioli, Member of the Sacred Congregation of Public Affairs of the Church. Initiated November 24, 1969. Code name Gaif. Alberto Bovone, Substitute Secretary of the Sacred Office. Initiated April 30, 1967. Terzo Natlino, Vice Prefect of the Archives of Secretariat of the Vatican. Initiated June 17, 1957. Code name Nate. Giorgio Vale, Priest Official of the Rome Diocese. Initiated February 21, 1971. Code name Vagi. Dante Balboni, Assistant to the Vatican Pontifical Commission for Biblical Studies. Initiated July 23, 1968. Code name Balda. Vittorio Trucchi, Secretary for Catholic Laity in Consistory of the Vatican. State Consultations. Initiated July 12, 1962. Code name Trovi. Piero Vergari, Head Protocol Officer of the Vatican State Sei Natura. He Controls canon law changes. Initiated December 14, 1970. Code name Pive. Dante Pasquinelli. Member of the Council of the Nuncio to Madrid. Initiated January 12, 1969. Code name Puta. Mario Pimpo. Vicar of the Office of General Affairs. Initiated March 15, 1970. Code name Pima. Igino Roger. Officer in the Diocese of Rome. Initiated April 16, 1968. Code name Igno. Pietro Rossano. Member of the Sacred Congregation of Non-Christian Studies. Initiated February 12, 1968. Code name Piro. Francesco Santangelo. Substitute General of Defense Legal Counsel. Initiated November 12, 1970. Code name Freza. Gaetano Scanagata. Member of the Commission of Pompeii and Loreto. Initiated September 23, 1971. Code name Gasca. Pio Laghi. Apostolic Delegate to Argentina. Initiated August 24, 1969. Code name Lappi. Pietro Santini. Vice Official of the Tribunal of the Vicariate of the Vatican. Initiated August 23, 1964. Code name Sepa. Domenico Semproni. Member of the Tribunal of the Vicariate of the Vatican. Initiated April 16, 1960. Code name Dos. Angelo Lanzoni. Chief of the Office of Secretariat of State. Initiated September 24, 1956. Code name Lana. Giovanni Lagiola. Member of the Council of Public Affairs of the Church. Initiated July 27, 1970. Code name Laghi. Venerio Mazzai. Member of the Council of Public Affairs of the Church. Initiated October 13, 1966. Code name Maeve. Antonio Grigagnon. He is the tribune of first causes for beatification for canonization. Initiated October 19, 1967. Code name Gria. Giovanni Capril. Director of Catholic Civil Affairs. Initiated September 5, 1957. Code name Jica. Roberto Tucci. Director General of the Vatican Radio. A most important post, since this station emits news round the clock in 32 languages. Initiated June 27, 1957. Code name Turo. Virgilio Levi. Assistant Director of the Vatican daily newspaper El Osservatore Romano, and of Vatican radio station. Initiated July 4, 1958. Code name Vile. There are 526 Masonic lodges in Italy. In view of that, their admitted membership of only 20,000 is questionable. The French register of secret societies is more closely guarded than the Italian, so that particulars of recent initiations cannot be quoted. The most sustained list of clerics belonging to French secret societies covers a few decades preceding the French Revolution, and it numbered, even at a time when infiltration of the Church by its enemies was on a smaller scale than it soon attained, some 256 members. Part 6, Mafia Bankers in the Vatican. When money speaks, the truth remains silent. Russian proverb. The adventurer Michel Sindona was already at the head of a vast financial empire when his friend Pope Paul VI, in 1969, made use of his services as financial advisor to the Vatican. The Sicilian's influence on both sides of the Atlantic was sufficient to ensure that he received universal respect, irrespective of personal character. The American ambassador in Rome referred to Sindona as the man of the year, and Time magazine was later to call him the greatest Italian since Mussolini. His connection with the Vatican increased his status, and his business operations, carried out with the dexterity of a spider spinning a web, soon placed him on a near footing with the more political and publicly advertised Rothschilds and Rockefellers. He burrowed into banks and foreign exchange agencies, outwitted partners as well as rivals, and always emerged in a controlling capacity. He invested money under assumed or other persons' names, disposing of and diverting funds, always with set purpose, and he pulled strings for the underground activities of the Central Intelligence Agency as well as for more secret bodies that brought about political repercussions in European centers. All this was done with an air of confidential propriety and by methods that would not have survived the most casual examination, carried out by the most inefficient accountant. One of his early banking contacts was with Hambro, and from that followed a list that came to include the Privata Italiana, Banca Union, and the Banco di Messina, a Sicilian bank that he later owned. He held a majority stake in the Franklin National Bank of New York, controlled a network that covered 9 banks, and became vice president of 3 of them. The real assets of those banks were transferred to tax shelters such as Switzerland, Luxembourg, and Liberia. Before long he had taken over the Franklin National, with its 104 branches and assets of more than $5 billion, despite an American law that forbade direct ownership of any bank by groups with other financial interests. But a way round this was found by then President Nixon, and by Sindona's friend and share manipulator David Kennedy, a former secretary to the United States Treasury and that country's ambassador to NATO. At one time it was reckoned that the amount involved in his foreign speculations alone exceeded $20 billion. Apart from the interests already named, 2 Russian banks and the National Westminster were finger deep in his transactions. He was president of 7 Italian companies, and the managing director of several more, with shares in the Paramount Pictures Corporation, Mediterranean Holidays, and the Dominican Sugar Trade. He had a voice on the board of Libby's, the Chicago Food Combine. He bought a steel foundry in Milan. It was only to be expected that, when estimating such a man, his past and his character counted for less than the jingle in his pocket. New friends, acquaintances, public figures, and distant relatives pressed forward for a sight of the Sindona smile, and among them was a churchman, Monsignor Amelito Tondini. Through him the financier met Massimo Spada, who managed the affairs of the Vatican Bank, or, to give it a more innocuous title, the Institute for Religious Works. Its main concern was with the handling of Vatican investments, which to some extent came under a body known as the Patrimony of the Apostolic See. That had come into existence, as a financial entity, in 1929, under one of the conditions of the Lateran Treaty concluded with Mussolini. It had since outgrown the limitations imposed by the treaty, and had taken on truly international dimensions under a conglomerate of bankers including John Pierpont Morgan of New York, the Paris Rothschilds, and the Hambros Bank of London. Its clerical supervisor was Monsignor, soon to be Cardinal, Sergio Ger. Spada, who was the chairman of Lancia, became chairman of a part ecclesiastical, part financial institution, known as the Pius XII Foundation for the Lay Apostleship, a very wealthy concern which was later taken over by Cardinal Villot, who was in many ways a reflection of Paul VI. There is always a sinister side to big money dealings, and one of Sindona's associates, Giorgio Ambrosoli, became increasingly nervous as the carrying out of increasing frauds kept pace with the profits, and with the effects they produced. In several European social, economic, and political structures, he expressed his doubts to Sindona, who brushed them aside. But he did not do the same with Ambrosoli. Instead, he made him the object of rumor and surrounded him with a network of suspicion. And one more unsolved crime was added to the Italian police register when Ambrosoli was shot dead outside his house by unknown assassins. Even before Sindona was concerned with its investment policy, the Vatican, despite its condemnation of money power in the past, was heavily involved in the capitalist system. It had interests in the Rothschild Bank in France, and in the Chase Manhattan Bank with its 57 branches in 44 countries, in the Credit Suisse in Zurich and also in London, in the Morgan Bank, and in the Banker Trust. It had large shareholdings in General Motors, General Electric, Shell Oil, Gulf Oil, and in Bethlehem Steel. Vatican representatives figured on the board of Finsider, which, with its capital of 195 million lire spread through 24 companies, produced 90% of Italian steel, besides controlling 2 shipping lines and the Alfa Romeo firm. Most of the Italian luxury hotels, including the Rome Hilton, were also among the items that figured in the Vatican share portfolio. Sindona's influence at the Vatican, deriving from his earlier friendship with Paul VI, and the recent meetings with Spada, was soon felt in much the same way as it had been in the outer world. He assumed complete control of the Banca Privata. He bought the Feltrinelli publishing house, and the Vatican shared in its income despite the fact that some of its productions included calls to street violence and secret society propaganda. The same quarter gave support to left-wing trades unions, and to the none too healthy work, often on the seamy side of the law, conducted by the Central Intelligence Agency. The same lack of discernment was shown by the fact that one of the firms that helped to swell the Sindona Vatican funds had been making, at least for a time, contraceptive pills. Other and more direct Vatican commitments were with the Ceramica Pazzi, which supplied taps, sanitary equipment, and bidets, and with a chemical group, again with Hambros in the background, that manufactured synthetic fibers for textiles. Vatican representatives appeared on the boards of Italian and Swiss banks, and their influence was increasingly felt in the management of holding companies in many parts of the Western world. Another shut-eye operation was when Cardinal Casiroli concluded an agreement with communist authorities, whereby one of the Vatican companies erected a factory in Budapest. Almost within hearing distance of the work was another cardinal, Mindszenty, Archbishop of Hungary, who, abandoned by Rome because of his anti-communist stand, had taken refuge in the American embassy after the abortive 1956 uprising. Had it been possible to conduct a genuine inquiry at that time, the names of Vatican officials would have been found figuring in some of President Nixon's complicated ventures. So much emerges when, by steering a way through a mass of often contradictory maneuvers, one pinpoints the Vatican ownership of the General Immobilier, one of the world's largest construction companies which dealt in land speculation, built motorways and the Pan Am offices, to quote but a few of its operations, and also controlled a major part of the Watergate complex in Washington. It was thereby enabled to build, and own, the series of luxury buildings on the banks of the River Potomac that became the headquarters of the Democratic electoral campaign in 1972. The management of the General Immobilier was in the hands of Count Enrico Galeazzi, the director of an investment and credit company, estimated capital 25 billion lire, who could so freely come and go at the Vatican that he was known as the lay pope. The Holy See became a substantial partner in Sindina's commercial and industrial empire in the spring of 1969 when, in answer to calls from Paul VI, the financier made several visits to the Vatican where the two men met, in the Pope's study on the third floor, at midnight. Only, so far as the minor clerics and staff of the Vatican were concerned, and according to the Pope's appointment book that was duly doctored before being entered up, it was not His Holiness who conferred with Sindina but Cardinal Ger, who in all probability was sleeping at the time. Besides wishing to fortify the Vatican's investment policy, the Pope was concerned with maintaining the Church's non-liability for government control, in the shape of tax, of its currency and assets. That exemption, with the Christian Democrats heading a four-party coalition since the end of the Second World War, had never been seriously questioned. But new voices were now being heard. The Vatican was named as the biggest tax evader in post-war Italy, and there was a growing demand for its arrears to be settled. Another member of this sanctified business circle was Paul Marcinkus, one of a Lithuanian family who had emigrated to Chicago. He was in the good books of Monsignor Pasquale Macchi, the Pope's personal secretary, and had so far not been prominent in any pastoral field. His most practical experience, in the sphere of church activity had been gained when, due to his standing 6 feet 4 in his socks, and his long powerful arms, which earned him the nickname of Gorilla, he supervised the guarding of Paul VI during his travels. Paul made him a bishop. As controller of the Vatican Bank, a post that was handed to him by Paul VI. He was responsible for more than 10,000 accounts belonging to religious orders and to private individuals, including the Pope. The number of the latter's account, by the way, was 16.16. He handled the Vatican's secret funds and its gold reserves at Fort Knox, and he transferred a substantial part of the funds, in the hope of making a quick profit, to the Sindina holdings. He was also president of the Institute for Religious Training, and a director of the Continental Illinois Bank of Nassau. His rise was neither unexpected nor brought about without influence being exerted, for on July 2, 1963, Marcinkus followed the example of those many clerics who, in defiance of Canon 2335, had joined a secret society. His code name was Marpa. Taking advantage of the fact that clerical garb was no longer essential, Marcinkus shouldered his way through the fringes, then into the colorful, noisy heart of Roman society. He was the affluent manager of one of the city's most influential, privileged, and respected banks. He lounged at bars, joined exclusive clubs that had hitherto been envied and far-off places to him, and showed his animal strength on the links by sending numerous golf balls into oblivion. In time, his blatant playboy attitude annoyed the more established Roman community, who turned a cold shoulder. It would seem that he had little more than gangling brawn to recommend him. But there were always plenty of Americans, who were there on business, to take their place, though even they were shocked when the bishop was said to be involved in fraudulent bankruptcy. Meanwhile, the first warnings, conveyed by hints of danger, were reaching Sindina and the Vatican from many parts of the world. The current call was to transfer money to the United States, as events in Europe pointed to political unrest and economic collapse, and the future of the Franklin Bank, in which Sindina and the Vatican were heavily involved, became highly doubtful following a series of disastrous speculations. There were frantic efforts to persuade more secure banks to buy outright, or at least refloat, the Franklin. Calls went out from Montini to arrange the transfer of Vatican investments to a safer haven. It was not that Sindona had lost his touch, but world forces, assisted by enemies in the mafia who envied Sindona's rise, were proving too much for the maintenance of far-flung ventures like some over which he had presided. Aware that he was standing on shaky ground, Sindona tried to gain the support of the Nixon administration, by offering $1 million, which perhaps could have materialized only if the deal had been accepted, for the president's electoral fund. But as Sindona, for obvious reasons, insisted on not being named, and since the acceptance of anonymous gifts for an election was forbidden by law, his offer was declined. It was disappointing for all concerned that it impinged upon one of the few laws that even the elastic federal system could not openly stretch. Sindona made a final gesture in the approved style of a Hollywood gangster. He threw a lavish and spectacular evening party at Rome's foremost hotel, that was probably owned by the Vatican, which was attended by the American ambassador, Cardinal Caprio, who had been in charge of Vatican investments before the arrival of Marcinkus, and the accommodating Cardinal Ger. Marcinkus merely came in for a great deal of blame. His operations with Vatican funds, said Monsignor Benelli, one of his critics, had been intolerable. But Marcinkus, who knew too much of what went on behind the scenes at the Vatican, could not be abandoned, and he was given a diplomatic post in the church. Sindona had been tipped off, by one of his hirelings who was also employed by the Secret Service, that a warrant was out for his arrest. But he bluffed and drank his way through the festivities, went off for a time to his luxury villa in Geneva, then took a plane to New York. There, pending actual charges, he was kept under a form of mild surveillance. But it seems that some of those who were detailed to watch him belonged to the mafia, and the next the Pope heard of his former advisor was that he had been shot and wounded in a scuffle. It was easy enough, by delving into his past that was more than ankle-deep in great and petty swindles, and now that he was no longer a power to be reckoned with, to bring him to trial, and an attempted kidnap case, and widespread bribery, were now added to the charges against him. When the obliging Cardinal Ger heard of this, he seems to have become suddenly convinced, perhaps because his name had figured in talks that clinched the bargaining between pontiff and financier, that Sindona was a much maligned man. He wanted to go to New York and testify on his behalf. But the Pope, aware of Ger's easygoing nature, and not wanting the extent of his own cooperation with the accused to be dragged out in the witness box, kept Ger in Rome. The trial ended, in the autumn of 1980, with Sindona receiving a sentence of 25 years imprisonment. Few, apart from those members of the public who expressed indignation as the financial antics of Sindona were made known to them for the first time, believe that such a sentence will ever be served. At least one anti-clerical paper suggested that Pope Paul was lucky not to have been put on the stand alongside his banker. As it was, the Pope was left with two reminders of their partnership. The Church had sustained a heavy financial loss, which meant, as the Pope asserted, with a quite gratuitous beating of the breast, that the Bride of Christ was face with bankruptcy, while there was a new administrative agency for finance that he had founded as a result of Sindona's help. At the head of this was Cardinal Vagnozzi, apostolic delegate in New York. He was assisted by Cardinal Hoffner of Cologne and Cardinal John Cody of Chicago. The last named of that trio was soon to make a sensational entry into The news. Cardinal John Patrick Cody, aged 73, the son of a St. Louis fireman, was Archbishop of the largest Roman Catholic diocese in America. He, therefore, had the handling of many thousands of tax-exempt ecclesiastical funds. And in the autumn of 1981 his congregation was overwhelmed, as only loyal church members can be, by rumors that soon became facts, to the effect that the United States Attorney's Office in Chicago was looking into Cody's financial affairs. A federal grand jury had also asked for the records of a St. Louis investment company, where a certain Mrs. Helen Dolan Wilson had an account, to be examined. The inquiry, most unusual in the case of a contemporary cardinal, turned upon what was called the diverting, disposition, or misuse of church funds, amounting to more than £500,000 in English money. It also came to light that the National Conference of Catholic Bishops had lost more than $4 million in a single year, during which time the cardinal had been treasurer. The Mrs. Wilson referred to, of the same age as the cardinal, was variously referred to as a relation of his by marriage, as his sister, as a niece, while Cody usually spoke of her as his cousin. Her father, more precise judgments claimed, had married the cardinal's aunt, while others were sure that no real blood relationship existed between them. The couple concerned said that a brother and sister relationship, begun in their childhood in St. Louis, was their only tie. "We were raised together," explained Mrs. Wilson. Their remaining close friends was therefore a natural development. They traveled together, and for the past 25 years she had followed his every move about the diocese. He had become, in the religious sense, her supervisor, a role that she found beneficial when her marriage, which left her with a son, ended in the divorce court. It was easy enough for the cardinal to place her, as manager, in an office connected with the church in St. Louis. Her appearances there were far from regular, but, whether working or not, she nonetheless remained on the church's payroll. He also helped her son to set up business, in the same town, as an insurance agent, a post that Wilson resigned when, with the cardinal, he started dealing in real estate. Mrs. Wilson retired, after having earned a modest £4,000 a year, but before long she was known to be worth nearly $1 million, mostly in stocks and bonds. She was also the beneficiary of a $100,000 insurance policy, taken out on the cardinal's life, on which she borrowed. The inquiries made by the federal grand jury, and publicized by the Chicago Tribune and Sun-Times, brought forth a flood of allegations. The cardinal had made over most of the missing money to her. Part of it had gone in buying her a house at Boca Raton, in Florida. There had also been a luxury car, expensive clothes and furs, and holiday cash presents. The cardinal, though saddened and feeling rejected because of the allegations, was firm in saying that he didn't need a chance to contradict them. He was ready to forgive all those responsible. Mrs. Wilson was equally firm in saying that she had received no money from the cardinal. To say that there was anything more than friendship between them was a vicious lie, or even a joke. She strongly resented being scandalized, and being portrayed as a kept woman. Or, as her fellow countrymen put it, a tramp. Had it not been for the many falls from grace that have overtaken the modern church, a case like this would scarcely have merited more than a mention. But now it prompts questions. Was it a frame-up, part of the age-long wish to bring the church into disrepute? Was the cardinal personally corrupt? Or was he one of the infiltrators who, without any real religious conviction, have been secretly fostered into the church for the sole purpose of wearing away its moral and traditional fabric? There is, in the light of other strange happenings that have occurred, nothing extravagant in that suggestion, and it would seem to be borne out by a long report in the Chicago Catholic of September 29, 1978. An archdiocesan liturgical congress was held in order, as one of the jargon-crazed modernists said, to keep the church living, moving, changing, growing, becoming new, after some centuries of partial paralysis. As part of that process, dance groups frolicked under flashing multicolored lights, trumpets blared, people reached and scrambled for gas-filled balloons, and donned buttons that bore the message "Jesus loves us," while a priest, who was looked upon as an expert in the new liturgy, his face whitened like a clown's, paraded about in a top hat and with a grossly exaggerated potbelly emerging from the cloak he wore. The background to all this was made up of vestments, banners, and the hodgepodge of a mural, all of which, in the approved style of modern art, revealed no more than casually applied splashes of paint. The mass that marked the close of this truly ridiculous Congress, that, as we shall see, was only a faint reflection of what happened elsewhere, and which would never have been dreamt of before the days of good Pope John, was presided over by Cardinal Cody. At another time the Chicago Tribune, in a report describing what was said to be a gaze altar, referred to a concelebration, meaning celebration of the Eucharist by 2 or more priests, at a church in that city. 122 priests were present at what passed for Mass, and every one of them was a self-confessed moral pervert. Neither of these profanities called forth a word of protest from John Patrick Cardinal Cody. He died of a heart attack in April, 1982, while this book was in preparation. Part 7, Scandalous Death of a Cardinal. Woe to him who doesn't know how to wear his mask, be he king or pope. Pirandello. The give and take of human relationships poses a more difficult problem than those that are normally accredited to science. For the latter will, in all probability, be solved in time, but when it comes to people, especially those who are no longer among the living, we are faced with questions that, in this our world, are unlikely to be answered. For instance, it has to be asked, why did two prelates, within a few months of each other, both die in circumstances that are not normally connected with any churchman, and, more especially in these cases, highly placed ones? When a party of Parisians, after having attended a religious festival in the country, returned to the capital late at night on Sunday, May 19, 1974, some of them noticed that the priest who had been in charge of them looked ill and tired. He was Jean Danilou, 69 years old, and a cardinal, no cut and dried character, but someone difficult to place in the minds of ordinary people who knew very little about him. He had entered a Jesuit novitiate in 1929, and had been ordained 9 years later. The author of 14 books on theology, and the head of the theological faculty at the University of Paris, he was also a member of the Académie Française. While revealing little, he made certain statements about himself that invited questions, even controversy. "I am naturally a pagan, and a Christian only with difficulty," was one of them, though that, of course, expresses a point of view held by many of his creed who know that little more than a knife edge exists between affirmation and disbelief. He was aware of new elements that were forming and gathering strength within the church, and although he judged freely a kind of Fear has spread, leading to real intellectual capitulation in the face of carnal excesses. The conservatives were no more able to number him among their kind than were the more vocal progressives. He was one of the founders, in 1967, of the Fraternity of Abraham, an interfaith group comprising the three monotheistic religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Today is a time when we sin against intelligence. Both sides could have claimed that as a dictum. Some accused him, when he appeared to hold back, of being prudish. But always he claimed to be uncommitted. I feel in the depths of my being that I am a free man. But freedom, when it is not a political catchword, can no more be tolerated in the world than truth, as the peasant girl Joan of Arc had realized centuries before. And the more Danilou withdrew from society and lived quietly at his residence in the Rue Notre Dame des Champs, without keeping a secretary or running a car, the more he became suspect, or openly disliked. None of this escaped him, but he tried not to dwell upon it. Had he done so, he owned that he would have been discouraged, a self-evident failure who had not taken advantage of the promise that was made available by his rise in the church. Later he found, or at least came to believe, that opponents were scheming and plotting against him. There was, indeed, a definite campaign of whispers and hints in the press that compelled him, though it was more a matter of choice than the force of actual opposition, to maintain a steadily but relatively unimpressive place on the fringe of things. So he remained, a problematic figure who arrived home on that Sunday midnight after an exhausting day in the country. But Monday brought no change in his routine. He said Mass, as usual, at 8 o'clock, then worked in his office and received a few visitors. He lunched at a restaurant, and afterwards called at the home of a professor at the Sorbonne. It appears, for some unexplained reason, that part of his mail went to an address in the Rue Monsieur, for he collected this, was back at his house at 3 o'clock, then left a quarter of an hour later, after saying that he expected to return at 5. But he did not. For at 3:48 the police received an urgent message from a Madame Santoni, who occupied an upper floor at number 56 in the Rue d'Ulong, a none too reputable quarter just north of the Boulevard de Batignolles. Her message brought the police rushing to the scene, for it told them that no less a person than a cardinal was dead on her premises. He, Danilou, had called there soon after 3:30. He had, so someone told her, run up the stairs 4 at a time, then collapsed at the top, purple in the face, and soon became unconscious. She had torn his clothes apart, and summoned help. But it was impossible to revive him, and the first arrivals had been helplessly looking on when his heart stopped. In answer to a radio announcement of the cardinal's death, the apostolic nuncio, with the Jesuit provincial of France, and Father Coste, superior of the Jesuits in Paris, arrived at the apartment, together with reporters from the France Soir, and nuns who were called in to deal with the body that was, however, already too rigid to be prepared for the funeral. Father Coste addressed the reporters. It was essential for them to maintain the utmost discretion, and having said that, he went on to state that the cardinal had died in the street, or it may possibly have been on the stairway, after he had fallen in the street. Oh no, it wasn't, broke in Madame Santoni. Father Coste objected to her interruption, the other clerics joined in, the police had their say, the reporters asked questions, and at the height of the argument, although no one actually witnessed her going, Madame Santoni disappeared and was seen no more at the inquiry. Now the lady in question thoroughly deserved the title of Madam. She was well known to the police and to the press, a 24-year-old blonde who traded under the name of Mimi, sometimes as hostess at a bar, a go-go girl at an all-night cabaret, or as a striptease dancer in the Pigalle. She was never on call at her home, which was run as a bawdy house by her husband. It was then, however, temporarily out of business, as he had been convicted only 3 days previously for pimping. Such explanations as the church chose to offer were vague, and all in line with the general verdict that the cardinal had burst a blood vessel, or suffered a heart attack. Cardinal Marty, the Archbishop of Paris, refused a request from Catholics as well as from secular quarters for an inquiry to be held into the cardinal's death. After all, he explained, the cardinal wasn't there to speak for himself. It may have been an unfortunate afterthought that caused the Archbishop to speak of the cardinal needing to defend himself. The eulogy was delivered in Rome by Cardinal Garone, who said, "God grant us pardon. Our existence cannot fail to include an element of weakness and shadow." One may wonder how deep Garone's soul-searching may have gone since. Although he was known to belong to a secret society, he brazenly sat it out and held on to his red hat. A comment by the Orthodox journal La Croix was briefer and more to the point. Whatever the truth is, we Christians well know that each of us is a sinner. This sort of happening supplied the left-wing anti-clerical papers with copy for a week. One such, La Canard and Chain, had scored heavily some years before, in a controversy over the ownership of a string of brothels within a few yards of the cathedral in Le Mans. The paper claimed that they were owned by a high dignitary of the church. His friends and colleagues strongly denied this. But the paper was proved to have been right. Now the same source had no hesitation in saying that the cardinal had been leading a double life. He had been under observation for some time, a step that was ordered by no less a person than M. Chirac, the Prime Minister. He and Jacques Foccart, a former Minister of the Interior, both knew perfectly well that the cardinal had been paying regular visits to Mimi. That in turn was ridiculed by Danilou's supporters, whereupon the paper retorted that there might be more revelations to come. If we were to publish all the details, it would be enough to shut you up for the rest of your natural days. The truth of this strange story may lie in one of 4 possible explanations. One may have its origin in the effects of the Second Vatican Council. Danilou was said by some to have regarded that as a positive disaster, and we know that he described the more liberal school of theologians, to which the council gave rise, as lamentable, miserable, execrable, wretched. Many resented this, especially when he went on to call them assassins of the faith. He determined to do what he could to prevent the faith being secularized and degraded, and this led him to think, since human tempers are just as hot within the church as they are outside it, that he was in danger. That would account for the somewhat enclosed life he led in Paris. But he let it be known that he was determined to make a stand, and he drew up a list of those he called traitors to the church. Some of those whose names were included breathed fire against him, but he publicly announced that he intended to publish the list. 4 days later, according to a theory held by many who are certainly not lightweights, he was murdered by those he would have named. Then, inspired by a kind of macabre humor, those he had called assassins had his body taken out and dumped in a brothel. After that, the surprising discovery could easily be arranged. That is written in full knowledge of how outrageous it must appear to those who regard the Church from a purely parochial level, in happy ignorance of its medieval history that was destined to be repeated, with all the cut and thrust and poisoned cups of that period, in a few years' time, and within the very walls of the Vatican Palace. Or could Danilo have been, earlier in life, one of those infiltrators whose influence he came to detest? Did he, after being initiated into one of the secret societies opposed to the Church, undergo a change of heart, which caused him to be looked upon as a menace? There is ample evidence that the societies had, and still have, no scruples in dealing with defaulters. That suggestion is not without substance. For in the Rue Putiaz, Paris, there is an ancient church, the crypt of which serves as the grand temple of the Grand Lodge of France. Some 3 years before Danilo's death, the auxiliary Bishop of Paris, Daniel Pézeril, had there been received into the lodge, after he had issued a communiqué to justify his action. In it he said, "It is not the Church which has changed. On the contrary, Masonry has evolved." It was Monsignor Pézeril who was asked, by Pope Paul, to seek a way of bridging the gap between the Church and the societies. Cardinal Danilo had been a not infrequent visitor to the crypt, where he was seen in consultation with one of the lodge masters who had been honored with the title of Grand Secretary of the Obedience. It must therefore be asked, does the answer to the mystery lie with those with whom Danilo had conferred in the crypt? But the story circulated by the satirical papers was the most shrill and insistent, and the most commonly known. They claimed that it had been obvious to those who had been in Madame Mimi's apartment before the police arrived that Danilo's body had been hurriedly dressed. And if he had not been one of her clients, why had he gone there with 3,000 francs that were found in his pocketbook? The purveyors of such scandal concluded that the cardinal had died in a state of ecstasy, if not of grace. Yet another version brings the story more up to date, with a trial that has now, the time is November, 1981, passed through its opening stage in Paris. On Christmas Eve, 1976, Prince Jean de Broye was shot dead by a gunman as he left a friend's house. The necessary inquiries brought a far-reaching web of fraud, complicity, and blackmail into the open, involving the former President Giscard d'Estaing and a friend of his, Prince Michel Poniatowski. The latter had recently ousted and taken the place of Jacques Foccart as Minister of the Interior, and Foccart was now using a woman, who was known also to Giscard, to get money from the prince. Foccart has already been mentioned in connection with the Danilo case. Since the known operation is obviously part of a vast cover-up, it is no more possible than it is necessary here to unravel the details, which leave all those concerned in a very murky light. But it is claimed that they account for Danilo's being in the brothel, and for the 3,000 francs that were found on his person. They were one of the installments that he had been paying, for the past 3 months, on behalf of someone, referred to as a friend of his, who was being blackmailed. A most disarming finale to all this came in the form of a line or two in an English religious weekly, the Catholic Herald, which briefly announced that Cardinal Danilo had died in Paris. Brief though the memory of the public is, there may have been a few lingering thoughts on Cardinal Danilo's mysterious death in the minds of some Parisians who noticed a bishop from the southwest of their country step from a train on the afternoon of January the 12th, 1975. He was Monsignor Roger Tourt, 57 years old, and Bishop of Montauban, on the River Tam just north of Toulouse. He was due to attend a meeting of the French Episcopal Commission, and he straightway proceeded to a room he had booked at the headquarters of the Catholic Aid Society in the Rue de Bac. His movements for the next couple of days are unrecorded, but on Thursday the 15th he lunched at the Commission's meeting place in the Rue du Regard, on the left bank of the Seine. It is possible that from there he went to meet a friend whom he had known during the war, but we know nothing certain about him until an alarm was raised, and a call went out to the police, on the night of the 16th. Excitement centered on the Rue du Ponceau, again on the left bank, a narrow street off the Rue Saint-Denis, a quarter notorious for brothels, prostitutes, and sex shops, where red lamps shone invitingly. The woman who raised the alarm kept one of the brothels. She had come across a man, who was obviously ill, in the street outside her door, and she got the help of two others of her kind to drag him inside. By then he was dead. Who was he? She neither knew nor cared. She had never seen him before. She had done what she could from purely humanitarian reasons. The red lamps winked as more people arrived and the contradictory stories went on. The stranger had died of a heart attack, between 7 and 11 o'clock, in the street, or in the corridor, or in one of the rooms. A news-hungry reporter said that the bishop, once his identity had been confirmed, had come a long way from his lodgings and from the Commission's meeting place. The reporter went on to say, backed by a snap judgment from the police, that, as in the case of Danilou, the body appeared to have been hastily dressed. A clerical apologist later advised all those interested to put away such thoughts as being totally unworthy. He pointed out that Monsignor Tourt, when found, was still wearing his bishop's ring, and his pectoral cross, and that his rosary was still in his pocket. Surely the presence of those objects was enough to prove that no inadmissible intentions had brought him into the district? The facts, so far as they could be known, did not admit of any shameful interpretation. The Church absolved the dead man from moral guilt, and within a few weeks, a new bishop was being installed at the small cathedral in Montauban. An elementary reading of these two episodes could be taken as evidence that churchmen, especially Catholic ones and, more especially, those of exalted status, may be hypocritical and corrupt. That, of course, will not be disputed by any save the willfully blind, and the fact that they may be members of secret societies, first and last, and therefore void of genuine religious conviction, is the theme of these pages. But there is no evidence to connect the deaths. In the cardinal's case there are signs, however tentative, that he had been persuaded to act a minor role in a major political scandal, or that he had taken a definite stand in a religious quarrel, and religious quarrels, like a civil war, admit of no quarter being given. There is, however, no trace of Monsignor Tourt being involved in anything startling. He can only be the object of assumption that he was the victim of personal weakness, of an accident, or of someone's wish to discredit religion. But as it is, Part 8, Modernism. Christian atmosphere, Christian tradition, and morality is diminishing, and is in fact to a great extent displaced by a way of life and thought opposed to the Christian one. Pope Pius XII. This section is concerned with some of the most dramatic changes in the whole of history, changes whose ultimate significance has, in the popular sense, gone largely unreported, and because of that they have been accepted without comment by the world at large. But they are changes that have set the tone of Our present, they are fashioning our future, and in time to come they will be so established that it will seem foolish, or eccentric, to question them. At the risk of being tedious, and in order to emphasize a vital point, it needs to be repeated that religious Rome was regarded, less than a generation ago, as the one fixed center of faith that would not change. It was proof against novelty. It despised fashion and towered above what is called the spirit of the age. Secure in itself, it admitted no speculation, none of the guesswork that too often goes by the name of discovery. It maintained one attitude and taught, century after century, one message that was always the same. So much was claimed by itself, endorsed by its followers, and recognized by its enemies. But just as in our time we have witnessed the spread of communism, so at the turn of the century another movement threatened what may be called the more static ordering of thought. It was, put very roughly, a mingling of the 19th century's liberal and scientific preoccupations, and its object was to treat the Bible to the same sort of criticism to which the political and scientific worlds had been subjected. Evolution, as opposed to settled and accepted truth, was in the air, dogma was questioned, and many saw this, though some of its propagators may not have intended it to go so far, as a denial of supernatural religion. The reigning pope of the time, Pius X, denounced modernism, as the new movement was called, as being no less than free thought, a most dangerous heresy. An encyclical, issued in 1907, and a condition he laid down a few years later, that clergy were required to take an anti-modernist oath, evidenced his firm opposition. And a similar situation was created later when Pius XII, brought face to face with communism, condemned it time and again, and in 1949 promulgated the sentence of excommunication against any Catholic who countenanced or supported it in any way. But a very considerable difference soon appeared between the receptions that greeted the opposition expressed by the two popes. Pius X had been accused, in the main, of arrogance and intolerance. But Pius XII, echoing the sentiments of Pius IX, Leo XIII, and Pius XI, was not only ridiculed by avant-garde journalists, one of whom called him a small-town aristocrat, but was actually opposed and contradicted by the man who in 1963 ascended the papal throne as Paul VI. His sympathy for left-wing politics had never been in doubt. He had cooperated with communists. His encyclical Populorum Progressio, issued in 1967 on the development of the world, was adversely criticized by the Wall Street Journal as warmed-up Marxism. But his being ranged openly on their side, and his reversal of earlier papal judgments, marked a new departure in a pontiff whose words carried to the greater part of the Christian world. He was fully in tune with the modern age, and responsive to the currents of the time. He was ready to open doors that every one of his predecessors, even those of doubtful character, had kept fastened. This was made clear in 1969, when he said, "We are about to witness a greater freedom in the life of the Church, and therefore in that of her children. This freedom will mean fewer obligations, and fewer inward prohibitions. Formal disciplines will be reduced, every form of intolerance and absolutism will be abolished." Such statements were welcomed by some, while others among his listeners were filled with apprehension, and when he referred to some normally accepted religious standpoints as being warped, and entertained only by those who were polarist or extremist, the hopes or fears of both modes of thought appeared to be justified. Was he paving the way for what would virtually be a new religion? freed from established notions and practices, and embracing all the advantages of the modern world, or was he bent on so paring down the established religion until, instead of standing out as decisive, unique, it appeared to be but one faith among many? So the two sides waited. One in favor of a promised relaxation, the other apprehensive lest many of their traditional supports were about to be dismantled. Here again, I feel it necessary to repeat, what follows is neither in the nature of attack nor of defense. It is a simple summary of events that occurred, and of declarations made, and if they appear to be partisan, it is not the fault of the present writer, but of Pope Paul, who made them all of one character. He challenged and condemned the unbroken front presented by Pius X in the face of modernism. The latter's imposition of an anti-modernist oath was said to have been an error, so Paul abolished it. The index of forbidden books, and the prerogatives of the Holy Office with its historic right to impose interdicts and excommunication, were now things of the past. The canon laws of the Church, hitherto regarded as pillars, the guardians and promulgators of decisions and judgments, were thrown open to criticism and, if need be, to revision. History and textbooks, written from a predominantly Catholic viewpoint, were blue-penciled or re-edited. The Church's contacts with the world, and with other religions, were to be more open, and no longer conducted from a height of superior authority, knowledge, and experience. There was declared to be no fixation of absolute truth. Discussion or dialogue was to take the place of declaration. And from these changes a new society of humanist culture would emerge, with an ostensible Catholic background provided by advanced theologians who, under Pius XII, had been kept on the fringes of the Church. They included Hans Küng, whose views were said to be more anti-orthodox than those advanced by Luther. He was to claim that he had been specially defended by Paul VI. The German Jesuit, Karl Rahner, whose brand of thought had formerly been frowned upon as being too extreme, was now told by Paul to forge ahead. The Dominican Schillebeeckx spread consternation among the already dispirited Dutch clergy with such statements as that Christianity would, sooner or later, have to surrender to atheism, as the most honest and natural man was the one who believed nothing. Teachers such as these, far from being reprimanded, retained their secure positions and were given a publicity, not usually accorded to churchmen, in the press. Even an Irish paper referred to Hans Küng and to Schillebeeckx as the most outstanding theologians in the world, and the belief that they were confident of having powerful support was strengthened when it became known in some ecclesiastical quarters, that prelates such as Swanens and Alfrink had threatened to form a cardinals' trade union if Hans Küng and his writings were condemned. The total ban on communism and its supporters, by Pius XII, was taken for granted, although it had never been actually enforced. But even so, there were demands for its removal. Instead of an icebound resistance to communism, that had been an accepted feature of the historic Church, a thaw set in, and it soon became no longer remarkable for a priest to speak and act in favor of Marxism. Some accompanied their change of heart with a profession of contempt for the past, as did Robert Adolphs, prior of the influential Augustinian house of Eindhoven, in Holland. Writing in the Church's different Burns and Oates, he said that the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas represented a pretty desiccated kind of Western thinking. He denounced the anti-modernism of Pius X as a fascist-like movement within the Church, and he ridiculed the warnings given by Pius XII, who had imagined that he had to do battle with a sort of underground modernist conspiracy that was making use of a widespread clandestine organization in order to undermine the foundation of the Catholic Church. The Flemish professor, Albert Dondane, was more outspoken in Geloof en Wereld, Belief and the World, where he criticized the mental outlook of the Church for always having been convinced as to the total perfidy of communism. He referred to the Church's habit of presenting things as though Christianity were simply and without reminder opposed to the communistic order of society as being extremely dangerous. Christian society makes God the servant of a kind of Christian party interest. It may identify communism with the devil, but what if this particular devil has been conjured up by the errors and shortcomings of Christianity itself? He admitted that the inhuman aspect of Marxism could not be denied. But this does not altogether preclude there being major positive values in communism to which Christianity of the 19th century ought to have been open, and to which Christianity must all the while remain receptive today. A similar plea emanated from a most unexpected quarter, the semi-official Vatican newspaper L'Osservatore Romano, which recommended Catholics being taught to collaborate with Marxists for the common good. Communism, it was urged, had changed dramatically since the time of Lenin and of Stalin, and there was now no reason why the Church, if only because of its humanitarian aspect, should not regard it as an ally. Old differences between them were disappearing, and the Church should now recognize, as more than one Western European government was on the point of doing, that communism had a vital part to play in helping to shape the future. Traditionalists eyed these advances with no little alarm. As they saw it, a door was being opened by which Marxist elements could enter into their stronghold, and those fears increased when communist and Vatican officials showed signs of entering into a partnership that had hitherto been unthinkable. Prelates whose names might be known to the public, the ever-serviceable Swinans, Willebrands, Bea, and Koenig of Vienna, exhibited a readiness to walk hand in hand with agents hot from Moscow, who, but a short time before, had ridiculed the Church's claim to moral sovereignty over the minds of men. Nothing now was said of that claim by either side. Instead, a list of everyday details, which maintained a steady growth over the years, showed how atheistic and orthodox spokesmen were passing from dialogue into a series of friendly exchanges. Archbishop Ciceroli, acting as middleman between the Vatican and the satellite states, flew in a red airliner to the Soviet capital. He and members of the Central Committee raised glasses together in the Kremlin. He dined with KGB officers in Bulgaria, and later in Czechoslovakia. The secular press circulated such items as proof that the Church had at last come down from its pedestal, and was accepting democracy, and the nervousness previously felt by traditionalists became downright fear when Paul VI, between the years 1967 and 1978, by his own words and actions, gave evidence of that very definite shift in Vatican policy. Let us telescope and summarize the elusive events of that time. Local armed risings in Africa were everywhere on the increase, and the Pope supported those movements even when they not infrequently led to the massacre of women and children. By a surprising turnabout, he said that the Christians in those parts were the terrorists, and the whites the latter had displaced had always exerted an influence that was bad. When the Reds finally took over the provinces of Mozambique and Angola, he hailed them as legitimate representatives of the people, and expressed a personal desire to meet some of the guerrilla leaders. Three of them, Amilcar Cabral, Agostino Neto, and Marcelino dos Santos, accordingly went to the Vatican, where there was a kissing of hands as the Pope gave them a letter expressing de facto recognition of their communist regime. but he was less forthcoming when a deputation showed him pictures, some revolting, of murderous activities carried out by West African terrorists. Skeptical journalists exchanged knowing looks when he made very obvious efforts to put them aside. Equally surprising was the affectionate respect he confessed for Abbot of Uganda, who had a long record of violence behind him and who is, at the moment of writing, still in the news as being a more bloodthirsty tyrant than the overthrown Amin. The blacks of Uganda were actually urged by the Pope. It must be the first call of its kind ever to issue from such a quarter to take up arms against the whites. In Algiers, many of the 500,000 Catholics there, under Monsignor Duval, were slaughtered when the overwhelming Muslim population turned against them. Duval abandoned his charges and joined their enemies, an act of betrayal that was rewarded by Pope Paul creating him a prince of the church. Another puzzling situation occurred in Spain, at a time when the shooting of police, by Basque gunmen, was at a startlingly high level. 5 of the gunmen were caught and sentenced to death. It was a time of grief for Pope Paul, who called the executions that followed a homicidal act of repression. He offered special prayers, but only for the murderers. Their victims were never mentioned. Thus encouraged by Rome, there was an upsurge of communism in Mexico and in Latin American states. Monsignor Ignacio de Leon, speaking for the Mexican bishops, declared that his church had shown itself to be useless in the face of social problems. Most fair-minded people will agree that it probably had. But no better example had been shown by the Marxism he openly preached from the pulpit. Cardinal Enriquez celebrated a Te Deum in his cathedral when Salvador Allende, who boasted of being atheist, became president of Chile. Many Catholics, swayed by the hierarchy, had used their votes to help him to power. The name of Christ was now rarely heard in those once highly orthodox countries, except when it was used to invite a depreciatory comparison with such luminaries as Lenin and Mao Zedong. The revolutionary Fidel Castro of Cuba was honored as a man inspired by God. Causes that excite suspicion are sometimes covered by euphemistic terms, and observers who were alarmed by Pope Paul's political leanings were liable to be assured that he was following a policy of expansionism, but whatever their nature, his sympathies certainly extended over a wide area. He confessed to feeling close spiritual ties with Red China. He sent his accredited diplomatic agent to the communist government in Hanoi. He voiced support for the atheistic regimes in Yugoslavia and Cuba. He entered into talks with the Russian-controlled government of Hungary. But he was less cordial in his relations with a traditionally orthodox country such as Portugal. His presence there in May 1967 excited comment, both on account of the almost casual arrangements he made for meeting the Catholic president Salazar, and the way in which, as one of his closest colleagues remarked, he practically mumbled when celebrating the Mass that marked the climax of his visit. It had been taken for granted that he would welcome a meeting with Lucia dos Santos, the last survivor of the 3 children who, in 1917, witnessed the apparitions, the strange phenomena that accompanied them, at the small town of Fatima. But the Pope put her aside with a testy, "Not now, later." As an afterthought he referred her to a bishop. A different kind of reception was accorded to Claudia Cardinali and Gina Lollobrigida, when the Pope received them at the Vatican. They were certainly not dressed in the approved way for a papal audience, and the crowd who had assembled to gape at the stars expressed admiration for the Holy Father's broad-mindedness. This would seem to be the place to introduce a report that reached me by Way of A. M. Maurice Guignard, a former student of the Society of Jesus at the College of St. Francis de Sales, Évreux, Normandy. The report, dated the 7th of August, 1972, originated from a body for the defense of the faith, of Waterloo Place, Hanover. It was drawn up out of obedience to orders given by Father Arapi, Superior General of the Society, and it was the work of Father Sines Arriaga, Doctor of Philosophy and of Canon Law. Apart from those influential Jesuits, it was substantiated and countersigned by the following members of the Society. Cardinal Danilou, the story of whose mysterious death, in 1974, is told in Part 7 of this book. Father Grignotz, private secretary and confessor to Father Arapi. Father de Béchillon, former rector of Évreux. Father de Lestapis, formerly of Évreux and for some time in charge of radio Vatican broadcasts. Father Bosque, formerly professor at Évreux and professor of sociology at the University of Mexico. Father Gallois, member of the faculty of the College of Lyons. Dealing with the past of Paul VI, it states that from 1936 to 1950 he was prominent in a vast network of espionage that covered some of the countries, on both sides, involved in the Second World War. It goes on to say that he was a principal shareholder, with a Maronite archbishop, of a chain of brothels in Rome. He found the money for various films, such as The Erotic Temptations of Marianne, which he financed on condition that the leading role was given to a certain actress named Patricia Novarini. When not working at the movie studio, this young lady performed as a striptease artist at the Crazy Horse Saloon, an exclusive nightclub in Rome. The tolerance accorded to film stars was, however, withheld from those who refused, even at great cost to themselves, to compromise with the Russians. 1. Such was Cardinal Slipy who, as Patriarch of the Ukrainian Church, had witnessed the deaths, deportation, or the unexplained disappearance of some 10 million of his fellow Catholics. He was ultimately arrested and spent some years in prison. When released, he cried out against traitors in Rome who were cooperating with those who had been his oppressors. "I still carry on my body the marks of the terror," he exclaimed to those who, like Pope Paul, were suddenly afflicted with deafness. The Pope, in fact, refused to recognize him as Patriarch, and from then on Slipy encountered a surprising number of obstacles and harassments at every turn. It was only to be expected that the Vatican's attitude would, sooner or later, be reflected by a similar change of heart among the people of Rome, and elections held there in 1978 brought about a result that would once have been regarded as a catastrophe, but which now passed as commonplace. For the newly returned president was Sandro Pertini, a lifelong member of the Communist Party who soon introduced measures that affected every sphere in the hitherto settled precincts of Italian family life. Many Catholics, influenced by the friendly relationship that had existed between the Red leaders and good Pope John, gave their votes to Pertini. Traditionalists called to mind the directions given by the Marquis de Francari in El Infallibilite Pontificale to those who were planning to infiltrate the Church. "Let us popularize vice through the masses. Whatever their five senses strive after, it shall be satisfied. Create hearts full of vice and you will no longer have any Catholics." And now, as the Marquis had rightly anticipated, a general breakdown occurred in every social grade and every department of life, from junior schools to factories, on the streets, and in the home. Murders increased, as did the kidnapping of wealthy people who were held to ransom. Crime and chaos flourished as a barrage of anti-police propaganda. weakened the law. The prevailing axiom, and not only among the young, was that anything goes. Pornography flourished. The hammer and sickle emblem was painted on church doors, and scrawls ridiculing priests, the church, and religion in general appeared on walls and hoardings. The Pope's reaction to this did not surprise those who were already dismayed by his pro-communist views. He invited Pertini to the Vatican, where, it was discovered, the two men had so much in common that their meeting was afterwards described by the Pope as having been emotional. The encounter brought us very close, he said. The eminent visitor's words were simple, profound, and full of solicitude for the welfare of man, for all humanity. In the same year Giulio Argan became mayor of Rome. He too was a hardened communist, and his election provided further proof of the way in which the political pendulum was swinging in Italy. Pope Paul, expressing satisfaction with the turn of events, looked forward to working with the mayor in a spirit of desire, confidence, and anticipated gratitude. We have so far given instances of the Pope's personal commitment to Marxist principles, and that he was by no means averse to compromising with or surrendering the Church's doctrine was proved by the way he handled the case of Elia Rotondi, a priest who left the Church and became an ardent worker for Moscow. Tondi married Carmen's auntie, whom he chose as being the possessor of a melancholy look and a sweet voice. Tondi had never been dispensed from his former vows, but Pope Paul had no difficulty in declaring that his marriage, void of any religious form, was canonically valid. Meanwhile Carmen had used her voice to such good effect that she was elected to the Soviet Chamber of Deputies, and afterwards to the Senate. Then, both KGB agents, they went to Berlin where Carmen, who was obviously more pushing than Tondi, who was experiencing qualms of conscience, became the leader of the Women's Communist Organization. Tondi, who never quite forgot his ordination, was suffering a premature dread of hellfire, and wished to return to the Church. Nothing could be easier, said the not at all squeamish Pope Paul. He removed the ban of excommunication from the penitent, assured him that he had no need to recant, and declared that his marriage was still perfectly valid. The fact of communism having been given a human face, and by no less a legislator than the head of the Church, was not without effect on other countries. When the National Committee of Catholic Action for Workers met in France, it was attended by 7 card-carrying members of the Communist Party. The French bishops overlooked their anti-national and disruptive tendencies. In England, Cardinal Hume of Westminster expressed sympathy for movements that challenged the authority of governments opposed to the left. And in February 1981, Cardinal Gray and his auxiliary bishop, Monsignor Monaghan, leaders of the Archdiocese of St. Andrews and Edinburgh, called on Catholics to support Amnesty International, a movement that, under the banner of human rights, gave what help it could, moral and otherwise, to agitators who, in several parts of the world, worked for the overthrow of established order. Dissatisfied elements within the Church, who had weaker voices and no clenched fist to emphasize their protest, soon discovered that they had no right of appeal against the imposition of what, to them, was a more deadly danger than heresy. A spokesman for traditional Catholics in America, Father Gamarda Peru, explained their bewilderment to the Vatican, and begged for guidance. His letter was not even acknowledged. When it was announced that a Congress of Spanish priests, for the defense of the Mass, would be held at Saragossa, an edict issued by Pope Paul, at almost the last minute, prevented the meeting. The once proudly independent colors of the Catholic Church were hauled perceptibly lower when Pope Paul entered into dialogue with the World Council of Churches. At that time, 1975, more than 270 religious organizations, of various kinds, were grouped under the council, and it soon became clear that it stood for the liberation theories that had been introduced by John XXIII and since furthered by Paul VI. It had funds to spare for subversive movements in what is called the Third World, so that even our press was forced to complain of the support it handed out. Its gifts were not niggardly. For instance, as the Daily Express deplored, £45,000 had gone to terrorists who were responsible for the massacre of white women, children, and missionaries, and the Anglican Church Times remarked that the World Council of Churches has developed a political bias recognizably Marxist in its preference for a revolution of a leftward character. The Catholic Church had always stood apart from the World Council. But the advent of ecumenism had changed all that, and the Council's dangerous tendencies were made light of in order to foster harmony between the different religions. Pope Paul, acclaimed as being always ready to move with the times, was willing to see eye to eye with the Council. But he had to move warily, as Catholic opinion throughout the world had, so far, been well trained to resist any encroachment upon its rights and its historical claim. So when asked whether an alliance could be effected, he returned a diplomatic not yet. But he showed where his sympathies were by following that up with a personal gift of £4,000 to further the Council's work and its aid to guerrillas. The present Pope, John Paul II, has announced his intention of renewing negotiations with the pro-terrorists. There is a more sinister note on which to end this summary of Pope Paul's intransigence. The name of a self-confessed devil worshipper, Cardinal, is practically unknown here, but in other countries his writings excited a variety of feelings, ranging from awed admiration to horror in those who read them. As a member of the Dominican order, he was given permission to speak in Paris Notre Dame in mid-Lent 1968. Listeners were struck by his rabid anti-Christian expressions, on account of which he was called Le Théologien de la Mort Dieu, the God's death theologian. He boasted of the title, left his order, and finally the church, and became a hardened devil worshipper. In a typical outburst he likened the Christian God to Stalin, to a beast, and finally to Satan. Pope Paul admired his work, and although he ignored requests from Catholics who wished to safeguard their religion, he made a special point of writing to Cardinal, congratulating him and sending good wishes. Part 9, The New Mass. O change beyond report, thought, or belief. Milton. The following section has been written with some misgivings. For on the one hand it leads up, in a subsequent part, to events that are startling, obscene, desecrating, which have taken place in buildings consecrated by ritual and by history, that the still practicing Catholic may prefer to ignore. While on the other hand it deals with the Church's teaching on the Mass, or rather, on what the Church taught about the Mass when it still spoke with an authority that was recognized even by those who refused to accept it. It is therefore necessary, to clear the understanding of those who may not have been acquainted with that teaching, to glance at a few essential aspects concerning it. The Mass was not merely a service. It was the central act in the Church's life. A great mystery by which bread and wine were consecrated and so became the actual body and blood of Christ. It was the sacrifice of Calvary enacted over Again, an earnest of the salvation effected by Christ who was there, under the sacred species of bread, this is my body, and wine, upon the altar. Whenever a Catholic found himself in strange surroundings, the Mass was there as a rallying point for his worship. So it had been, with but a few minor alterations, for Latin Catholics from the earliest Christian centuries, beginning, roughly, from the 7th century, on record. And so it would remain, the Church taught and the faithful believed, until the end of time, a bulwark against error that inspired an air of sanctity or impressive hanky-panky, call it what you will, that was recognized by devotee and disbeliever alike. Typical of those who knew this was the liberal and Protestant Augustine Birrell, 1850 to 1933, who was sometime Secretary for Ireland. It is the Mass that matters, he said. It is the Mass that makes the difference, so hard to define. Between a Catholic country and a Protestant one, between Dublin and Edinburgh. The unique quality of what may be called, in pedestrian terms, a landmark in religion, has always influenced the plans of those who set out to overcome the Church. The Mass has always stood in their path, a stumbling block that had to be demolished before their attack could make headway. It was denigrated as a base superstition, a mere operation of the hands, accompanied by words that deceived the overcredulous. The assault against it was heaviest, and partly successful, in the 16th century, and when the Church recovered its breath it called a council that took its name from the little town of Trent, which later became an Italian province, where the principles of the Counter-Reformation were defined. And those principles took shape, largely, as a defense of the focal point that had never been lost sight of the Mass. It was codified by Pius V, the future saint who had started life as a shepherd boy and who, in keeping with Rome's verdict that Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn had been invalid, declared that their child, the English Queen Elizabeth I, was therefore both heretic and bastard. And from then on the echoes of his firm, uncompromising yet always dignified thunder had lived on in association with the old Romanesque Cathedral of Trent, the place that gives its name, Tridentine, to the order of the Mass that was intended to pass into general use for the whole Church, and for all time. The missal he drew up, and in which this was decreed, leaves no doubt as to that. At no time in the future can a priest ever be forced to use any other way of saying Mass. And in order once for all to preclude any scruples of conscience and fear of ecclesiastical penalties and censures, we declare herewith that it is by virtue of our apostolic authority that we decree and prescribe that this present order of ours is to last in perpetuity, and never at a future date can it be revoked or legally amended. The decree specifically warned all persons in authority, of whatever dignity or rank, cardinals not excluded, and to command them as a matter of strict obedience never to use or permit any ceremonies and Mass prayers other than those contained in this missal. This was repeated, as though to make doubly clear even to those who were already converted, that he was speaking as Pope. And so this council reaches the true and genuine doctrine about this venerable and divine sacrifice of the Eucharist, the doctrine which the Catholic Church has always held, and which she will hold until the end of the world, as she learned it from Christ our Lord himself, from the Apostles, and from the Holy Ghost. Few papal assertions have been more explicit. The Mass, as generally known, was to be preserved, unaltered and unalterable, for all time. But Cardinal Bugnani, who had gone on clinging to the office after his membership of a secret society had become known, and Paul VI, who affected to be unaware of any Such revelation made short work of Pope Saint Pius V's pronouncement. It later became known that some 20 years before Vatican II made pulp of the traditional Mass book, a priest-professor had been detailed to draw up plans for gradual liturgical changes, while in December 1963 the Council introduced new practices and a new phraseology that, at first, made little impact on the public. But now Pope Paul and Cardinal Bugnani, assisted by Cardinal Lercaro, went straight ahead, with the assistance of non-Catholics whom they called authoritative experts of sacred theology. The experts called in to amend the most holy sacrament of the Catholic Church comprised one or two Protestants, Canon Ronald Jasper, Robert McAfee Brown, a Presbyterian, Brother Thurian, who was a Lutheran, a Calvinist, a rabbi, and a certain Joachim Jeremias, a one-time professor of Göttingen University who denied the divinity of Christ. Bugnani said that they were merely present as observers, that they had no voice when the changes were discussed. But apart from the fact that they claimed to have played an active part in the concilium, that they commented upon it and made suggestions, one need only ask why, without some set purpose, were they ever invited to participate? Whatever this very mixed bag decided, said Pope Paul, would be in accordance with God's will. It was also intended to correspond to the temper of modern man. And what emerged from their deliberations was a Novus Ordo, new Mass, Missal, a veritable sign of the times, which meant that the era of a mini-Mass, and of pop music in church, with all the profanities it led to, was about to begin. Such innovations extracted a blind obedience from those who believed that conformity to whatever was said and done by the priesthood, especially in church, was a virtue. Some who questioned the changes were told not to presume any further. It was said to be contumacious, and displeasing to God. While the fact that many were resolute in opposing the changes, and turned their backs upon the Novus Ordo, called forth the charge that they were in mortal sin, and inflicting another wound on the loving Father who was waiting to welcome them. After all, the Vatican and its spokesman-in-chief, Pope Paul, had approved the changes. A revolution had been achieved, and it was all for the good. The old Roman Missal had become a back number. The progressives were cock a hoop. And now they proceeded to pass beyond their original objective and pressed forward. A number of what may at first appear to be minor practices came under their scrutiny. Genuflecting, and kneeling to receive Holy Communion, were found to be unnecessary. One entering a church, the interior of which had long been familiar, suffered a shock when it was seen that the perhaps priceless travertine altar had been replaced by a table, at which the priest, who was now sometimes called the president, faced the people and, in a clumsy vernacular instead of the old verbal music, for Latin has always been hated by the enemies of the Church, invited the congregation to join in a repast. The manner of receiving communion now differed greatly. The host might be given into the hand, as was evidenced when Pope Paul celebrated a new Mass at Geneva. A number of hosts were passed to a girl who was standing conveniently near, and these she distributed into the hands, sometimes grubby or sticky, of those about her, or into the hand of any chance looker-on who came up to see what was being given away. Another method was to place the one-time sacred elements in a chalice and then invite the people to come forward and help themselves. An extra relish could be given to the bread by dunking it in the wine. It had hitherto been out of the question for non-Catholics to receive communion at Mass. But Pope Paul introduced a new updating by permitting a self-confessed Presbyterian lady, Miss Barbrina Olson, to receive the wafer. His example was followed. First Cardinal Bea, and after him Cardinal Willebrands, empowered their bishops to issue an open invitation, and then Cardinal Swinans, at the close of a congress at Medellin, in Colombia, called on all and sundry to come forward with open mouth or ready hand. A more decisive battle was fought out in Rome, where Bugnani's new Mass was celebrated in the Sistine Chapel. A large majority of the prelates who were present voted against it. The actual numbers were 78 in favor, 207 against. The Orthodox Cardinal Ottaviani, who never lost caste, examined the text of the Vandalized version, and found that it contained some 20 heresies. The new Mass, he said, departs radically from Catholic doctrine and dismantles all defenses of the faith. The same sentiment was expressed by Cardinal Heenan of Westminster. The old boast that the Mass is everywhere the same is no longer true. Ottaviani was head of the Holy Office, which exercised guardianship over faith and morals. Pope Paul clamped down upon the office, and clipped the cardinal's claws, and he was so annoyed by the adverse vote that he forbade the new Mass ever to be the subject of a ballot again. From then on it was given official, but not popular sanction. Thousands of people, who would not tolerate a form of the Mass that was less dignified than the Protestant communion service, either left or stopped going to church. Many priests followed suit. Those who stood by the incontrovertible ruling of Pius V on the Mass were threatened with suspension, or even excommunication. One of the first to be declared anathema, for observing the old Mass, was a priest who was somewhat remote from the scenes of tension, a Father Carmona of Acapulco, in Mexico. Bishop Ackerman of Covington, America, when faced with a number of Orthodox and therefore recalcitrant priests in his diocese, lamented helplessly, "What can I do? I can't throw them into jail." Their doubts were embodied in a question that was left for Pope Paul to answer: whether the introduction of the new Mass was the beginning of an age of new darkness on the earth, or the harbinger of an unprecedented crisis within the Church. He refused to answer. And the same wall of silence was encountered by a deputation of priests who begged for a return to the traditional Mass, while thousands from several parts of Europe, who went to Rome with the same purpose in mind, were turned away. Those who brought about the changes had not been working blindly. They had followed a plan, in conformance with the secret design that furnishes the theme of these pages. They now had the future in their hands, and the confident way in which they accepted this was made clear by an article in El Osservatore Romano, which depicted the pretty hopeless future awaiting those priests who braved the wrath of the Vatican by carrying out the duties for which they had been trained. They would, said the article, become headless, autonomous priests facing an arid, squalid life. No sheltered future, no promotion to the hierarchy, no expectation of a pension at the end of their ministry. One who had been most zealous in promoting the changes sang their praises in the following terms: "It is a different liturgy of the Mass. We want to say it plainly. The Roman Rite, as we knew it, exists no more. It has gone. Some walls of the structure have fallen. Others have been altered. We can look at it now as a ruin or as the particular foundation of a new building. We must not weep over ruins or dream of an historical reconstruction. Open new ways, or we shall be condemned as Jesus condemned the Pharisees." Pope Paul was equally extreme in approving the findings of the Second Vatican Council's Commission on the Liturgy. The old rite of the Mass is in fact the expression of a warped ecclesiology. Reading that, some may have been reminded of the old coronation oath. That ran as follows. I vow to change nothing of the received tradition, and nothing thereof I found before me guarded by my God-pleasing predecessors, to encroach, to alter, or permit any innovation therein. To the contrary, with glowing affection to reverently safeguard the passed on good, with my whole strength and my utmost effort. To cleanse all that is in contradiction with canonical order that may surface. To guard the whole canons and decrees of our popes likewise as divine ordinances of heaven, because I am conscious of thee, whose place I take. Through the grace of God. If I should undertake to act in anything of contrary sense, or permit that it will be executed, thou willst not be merciful to me on the dreadful day of divine justice. Accordingly, without exclusion, we subject to severest excommunication anyone, be it myself or be it another, who would dare to undertake anything new in contradiction to this constituted evangelical tradition and the purity of the Orthodox faith and the Christian religion, or would seek to change anything by his opposing efforts, or would concur with those who undertake such blasphemous venture. Whenever this oath may have been taken at the time of a coronation, I know not. But its principles, until the Roncalli era, were tacitly accepted and endorsed as a conventional part of papal observance. For instance, one of the greatest and most gifted of the popes, Pius II, 1458-64, in his bull Execrabilis, repeated a law that was endorsed through the centuries and accepted, without modification, by what has always been referred to as the magisterium of the Church. Any council called to make drastic change in the churches beforehand decreed to be void and annulled. But Paul VI, the friend of communists, who collaborated with the anarchist Alinsky and with the mafia gangster, Sindona, issued his own statement of policy, which appeared in El Osservatore Romano, on April 22, 1971, English edition. We moderns, men of our own day, wish everything to be new. Our old people, the traditionalists, the conservatives, measured the value of things according to their enduring quality. We, instead, are actualists. We want everything to be new all the time, to be expressed in a continually improvised and dynamic, unusual form. It was raving of this sort, reminiscent of Peter Simple's sarcasm in the Daily Telegraph, that led to the introduction of eatables such as roast beef, jellies, and hot dogs, washed down by draughts of Coca-Cola, in the holy sacrifice of the Mass, and to nuns clicking their heels and twisting their bodies, in a kind of carmagnole, to mark the offertory. Antichrist, said Hilaire Belloc in 1929, will be a man. But perhaps the most ludicrous justification of the change was put forward by one of our most progressive bishops, who said to the present writer, "The new Mass got off to a ringing start yesterday. The guitars were going all over my diocese. The doctrinal and liturgical changes in the Church were not long in showing the effects that the conservatives had forecast, and startling though many of them were, they still remain largely unknown even to people who live in the countries where they occurred. It used to be looked back upon as an outrage of the most extreme order, when, during the French Revolution, a harlot was hoisted onto the altar of Notre Dame, where she was crowned and worshipped as the goddess of reason, or when Chartres Cathedral was on the point of being converted into a temple of reason. But such things pale into insignificance when compared with the desecrations and obscenities that have taken place, often with the approval of prelates, in some of the most revered Catholic ministers on both sides of the Atlantic. There was a marked falling off from established ritual when such things as a Communal supper took the place of a solemn mass, when the priest, armed with a bread knife, had a large loaf placed in front of him which he proceeded to cut into chunks, helping the others and then himself until a general munching of jaws showed their appreciation of the body of Christ. Such suppers, served in a parishioner's house, became a regular feature of Dutch family life. Sometimes, the lady of the house, instead of a priest, officiated at Mass that was served in her best room. There were not a few places where the traditional office of priest was taken over by a woman, who walked among the congregation giving out the sacrament to any who stood with gaping mouth and a nauseous display of tongue and teeth. Sometimes it was placed in the sweaty hand of a child, or between the trembling fingers and palm of a geriatric who promptly dropped it on the floor, where it could be trampled, or it might be self-administered. One small girl came away from Mass, in one of the more advanced quarters of Holland, saying that she had learnt more there than she ever had through seeing her brother in a bath. For the altar boy who, in England, would have passed for a fourth former, had been naked. Pope Paul, determined not to lag behind in the scurry for progress, signed a special edict whereby any who cared to help themselves to the blood of Christ could suck it up through a straw. In that way some churches came to resemble a coffee bar, especially when the blare of a discotheque issued from the sanctuary, together with the shouting, strumming, and stamping of feet that accompany the celebration of a jazz mass, a beat, and a yeah-yeah mass. There were teenage masses where, instead of the sacramental bread and wine, hot dogs, buns, and Coca-Cola were served. At others, whiskey and cream crackers took the place of the elements. Some priests found the wearing of an alb inconvenient when saying Mass, and so resorted to shirt sleeves. The new freedom offered a chance for political extremists to advertise their usually left-wing tenets. One of the foremost seminaries in Canada was sold to Chinese Reds, who tore out the tabernacle and put in its place a portrait of the wholesale murderer Mao Zedong. It later became a training center for revolutionary street fighters. In September 1971, the Catholic school at Val-d'Or, Abitibi, Quebec, initiated a new game for boys. It consisted of spitting at the figure of Christ on the cross, and the one who covered the face with the biggest spit was declared winner. This was reported in the French-Canadian paper, Ver Domaine, in September 1971. In one South American province, where disturbances rarely died down, a local bishop Quesaldaliga came out on the side of the Russian-inspired insurgents. He adopted the rough and ready garb of a guerrilla, complete with cartridge belt, and went on preaching and officiating at Mass under the name he gave himself, Monsignor Hammer and Sickle. But a truly sinister scene was enacted at the Basilica of Saint Maria de Guadalupe in Mexico City, where a goat was sacrificed in front of the high altar. Now it is not only the fact of an animal being killed, and in church, that excites comment. It seems to have called for none from the people there present, who gaped, were astonished, and then walked away, no doubt concluding that it was all part of the new order within the church. And so it was. But Archbishop Gomez, who had charge of the basilica, knew more than that, as did the strange crowd of people to whom he actually rented it for the occasion. The goat, said to have been created by the devil, figures in the satanic lore of those whose secret design has always been the downfall of the church. The happening referred to resembles part of the old pre-Christian ritual, when a goat was sacrificed at an altar during the Day of Atonement. The sins of the high priest, and of the people, were transferred to a second animal of the same species, which then became the scapegoat and was driven into the wilderness. Or, in demonology, it was forced over a cliff into the hellfire that was tended by Azazel, a fallen angel. Hence it was no ordinary mass but a black mass that was celebrated in Mexico City, with the use of an inverted cross, an event that was filmed and recorded by those who arranged it. But such things marked only a beginning, as did a growing clamor, supported by priests, for abortion and for sexual aberrations to be recognized as perfectly normal. There were priests who almost shouted from the housetops that they were glad to be homosexual, as it was a privilege that conferred the psychological fulfillment of one's personality. It became accepted, in some parts, for perverts of the same sex to be married in church. In Paris, a man and a woman, minus every stitch of clothing, paraded their nakedness before an altar, where they were married by a priest who conveyed to them what has been called the sublime nuptial blessing. Advanced Holland, not to be outdone, reacted with the news that a couple of male homosexuals had exchanged vows and tokens in a church wedding, while an American priest, who was still holding on despite the fact that he had been cited in a divorce case, gleefully smote his breast and affirmed that he too was an emancipated moral pervert, which he afterwards ratified by uniting a pair of lesbians in matrimony. It was a fruitful time for cranks and opportunists of every kind. An ex-nun, Rita Mary, joined an American lay community whose members were committed to the new spirit emerging in religious life. A breath from that spirit of newness suddenly revealed to her that God the Father is female. Others who favored the cause of women's liberation adopted the same slogan, and as part of their campaign cars adorned with stickers exhorting people to pray to God, she will provide, appeared on the streets. Traders were quick to seize upon it as a good stunt, and Rita Mary's vehicles were soon joined by others offering a more material tip, with Jesus on your side. You can be a more successful businessman. Still keeping to America, there was a gathering at Steubenville, Ohio, in July 1976, at which 1,000 priests endorsed a novel intention to declericalize the ministry, which meant, in effect, putting themselves out of work. They were advised to get ready for the collapse of the social order. Then, after prayers, some discovered that they had been given the gift of healing. A general laying on of hands followed, and from that the mixed congregation, amid shouting, fell to hugging and kissing each other. Bursts of spontaneous affection, as we shall see, were fast becoming a feature of the new Mass, as also was a growing obsession with sex. The exploration of touch, referring to bodies, became a new kind of worship. At a meeting in Philadelphia, where Cardinal Wright and 8 of his bishops were present, the main speaker, Father Gallagher, told his audience that touching is crucial. And it may be assumed that many suppressed instincts found a relief that had long been clamored for in the words that followed, "Do not hold hands sexlessly." The 9 prelates conveyed smiles and blessings to the love-in, as such displays of emotion were coming to be called, that followed. A variation on the same theme was heard at the National Pastoral Congress at Liverpool in 1980, where a declaration was passed that, much to the surprise of a representative English audience, deified the most taken for granted of their marital acts. During sexual intercourse a man and his wife create Christ, a statement that sounds suspiciously like Aleister Crowley's words, that sexual organs are the image of God. The latest excursion into the realm of ecclesiastical nonsense, January 1982, has been made by Bishop Leo McCarty, the Catholic Auxiliary Bishop of Birmingham. Let Rastafarians, he urged, the mostly young blacks who wear woolly caps and plait their hair into strings, be given the use of church premises. They worship the late Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia as the true God. They believe that Christ was black, and they smoke cannabis as part of their religious ritual. The bishop admits that the church could not condone the smoking of cannabis on its premises, but only because it is against the law, my emphasis. Piers Compton. But Rastafarianism, he goes on, is a valid religious experience. And its followers use cannabis like a sacrament, which is comparable to the chalice or communion cup in Christian worship. So now we know. Let us take a few more instances of what the modernistic trend has achieved. In America, all, let it be remembered, without calling forth more than an isolated protest, here and there, from any of the hierarchy. Moreover, it was all approved by Pope Paul, as was shown by the presence of his official representative, who passed on papal greetings to those who dressed up, cavorted, and made irreligious idiots of themselves to demonstrate the new freedom. For the past 2 years, on June the 28th, St. Patrick's Cathedral, New York, has been the finishing point of what is known, to ecclesiastical and secular authorities alike, as a gay parade. In 1981, an estimated crowd of 50,000 marched up Fifth Avenue, led by a figure with a whitened face, and wearing a frilly ankle-length dress and a bonnet, who spun up and down the road and pavement in front of the cathedral on roller skates. At least one of the lookers-on recognized the figure as being that of a reputable Wall Street broker. An individual who was hailed as the Grand Marshal of the parade then stepped from a black limousine, performed clown-like on the steps, then delicately holding a bouquet of pansies, made as if to enter the front door. By that time a Mr. Macaulay, who practiced as a New York attorney, already sickened by what he had seen, snatched the flowers and threw them in the faces of those who swarmed after the marshal. A scuffle broke out, and police led the objector away. It took 2 hours for the parade to pass a given point and gather about the cathedral. Some were dressed as priests, others were nuns, some were wearing black leather and chains. There was a group called Dignity, and another known as the North American Man-Boy Love Association. They carried a large sign announcing that Man-Boy Love is beautiful, the older members walking arm in arm with boys, whose average age was about 13, and some of whom wore bathing suits. The gay socialists carried a red banner, and shouted their hatred of God and the church as they marched. But their frenzy was more than matched by that of the gay militant atheists, who roared in unison, "Smash the church! Death to the church!" Another cry of "Smash the state!" showed that the real driving power behind the demonstration was making itself heard. Then came an interlude as a male, in a nun's habit and trailing a cross upside down, executed a dance, accompanied by obscene gestures, for a full half hour. That was followed by a group that came forward and made as if to light a candle at the cathedral door. By then Mr. Macaulay had returned. He renewed his protest, asked the police to stop the outrageous performances, and was promptly arrested. The homosexuals then proceeded to drape a large banner about the barricades they had erected at the front steps of the cathedral. A captain of the city fire department then came forward and asked a police officer to intervene. The officer turned his back, whereupon the fire chief seized the banner, rolled it up and threw it on the ground. The yelling mob swarmed over him. He was pulled down, his jacket was torn from his back, blows rained upon him, his fingers were seized and bent in an effort to break them, his legs were forced apart and hands reached for and grabbed his genitals. When he could speak, he told the police officer that he wished to press charges against those who had attacked him. The policeman sneered. "Come back tomorrow at the same time and see if you can recognize them." When the fire chief persisted, the policeman gripped his revolver so tightly and menacingly that his knuckles were seen to whiten. Only 2 people were arrested, Mr. Macaulay and the fire chief, both for disorderly conduct. They later heard the charges against them being framed. One police official said, "Say that you saw him assault someone." Another said, "Put in that he broke through the police line." Meanwhile the parade was going on, with the cathedral front being emblazoned with provocative signs and banners, one announcing that Jesus was a homosexual. Doggerel was chanted. 2, 4, 6, 8. Do you know if your kids are straight? Finally a flag was hung from the cathedral door. It was designed like the American flag, except that in place of the stars, sex symbols and representations of the penis were substituted. The demonstrators, followed by a large crowd, made their way to Central Park, where they engaged in a free-for-all public exhibition of sex acts. Frightened people who had gone to the cathedral in search of consolation or quiet bunched together throughout the afternoon inside chapels and corners. When approached on the matter, the members of the diocesan curia said there had been nothing to complain about. In Virginia, a priest drove a Volkswagen down the aisle of his church to mark Christ's entry into Jerusalem. Later he had a fork one-if placed in the churchyard and climbed into its basket, where he stood waving his arms while being lifted up to commemorate Ascension Day. In Boston, Massachusetts, priests attired as clowns, with red hearts decorating their foreheads, scrambled and jostled about a church trying to catch balloons. A priest wearing a singlet and jeans cavorted in church with a girl whose flesh bulged from her leotard. In this country, one Sunday evening, television went out of its way to show an auxiliary bishop processing up the aisle of one of our Catholic cathedrals. He was led to the altar by a young girl who danced and skipped about in front of him like a young horse. The celebration of Holy Mass in another church concluded with the singing of "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow." Similar outbreaks occurred even in Latin countries, where the mysteries of the Church had long been part of the national consciousness, its blood and bone. 4 visitors to a church near Grenoble, in the Isère department of France, on a day in 1970, were surprised to see that the ornaments and candlesticks were being removed from the altar, and that the space before it was cleared. Then, ropes were put in place to form a business-like representation of a ring where, according to the bills, an international boxing contest was to take place. Note: for more details of this and other events in Rome, see From Rome Urgently, Strati Mari, Rome, by Mary Martinez, a lively book to which I am much indebted. I have also drawn upon another eyewitness account by Louise Marciana, formerly a sister of the Precious Blood. It was at that order's convent that some of the antics here described took place. At the appointed time, a throng that was far from typical of the usual one seen there, and mostly male, shuffled, stumbled, or made their way arrogantly into the building where some of them had been baptized, and some married. As they acquired a more familiar feeling, odds were shouted and bets made, but details of the fight were never recorded. Whether it was one on points, or a knockout, who acted as referee or timekeeper, and who plied the sponges, how much the church funds profited from the purse or the takings, none of this appears in the parish register. Neither does a protest from the bishop. On a Friday in early December, 1974, the Coronation Church of France. Reims Cathedral was given over to a horde of hippies and layabouts for one of their all-night sessions. The Archbishop and his clergy, who had obligingly provided the setting, may have noted, with a feeling of envy, as the prematurely aged youth of the district poured in, that they far exceeded in number those who were seen at High Mass on Sundays and holy days. Cacophony was provided by the Tangerine Orange Group, and when the mixed congregation grew tired of waving their arms and shuffling in time to the uproar, they settled down to an orgy of drugs and hashish smoking. When this affair became known, angry parishioners demanded that the cathedral, which occupies a special place in history, should undergo a service of purification. But their protests were waved aside by Father Bernard Gouraud, who held the always questionable post of cultural attaché of the archdiocese. He agreed that the dancers and smokers had been left to their own devices for hours in the Gothic darkness. But, he added, things might have been worse. Indeed they might. We are told that they only urinated and copulated on the stone floor over which the kings of old France had passed on the way to their anointing, and where Joan of Arc, holding her blazon, had stood like a soldier home from the war. Also in France, it was not unknown for a priest to light and smoke a cigarette while saying Mass. Even Rome was not immune from the sacrilegious parodies that followed the new religious freedom, the opening of the windows of the church. The scene of 1, in 1975, was the classroom of a Roman convent. Pope Paul was present. But the star turn was provided by Fred Laidneus, a gentleman from the Middle West who had acquired celebrity through appearing on Belgian television. He had furthermore been spoken of by an enthusiast as the born-again spirit, whose God updated the Jesus of 1974 by being the God of 1975. Fred set about his task right manfully, stripping off his jacket and giving voice to almost incoherent ravings for which, he said, he was in no way responsible. What they heard were some of the truths he had received, that very morning, from the Lord's mouth. For the Lord spoke and prophesied through him. Fred accompanied these revelations by flinging up his arms so violently that he broke into a sweat. But he was by no means exhausted. He rolled up his shirt sleeves and invited all those who wished to receive the Lord, to come up rapido. Fred, though still in a state of undiminished perspiration, waved his hands frantically over the heads of those who accepted the invitation, and accompanied each gesture with a cry of hallelujah. At the end of these ministrations the school blackboard was moved to make way for a table, on which were placed 2 chalices, one holding wine, and the other wafers of the kind that are used to celebrate Mass. Then everyone fell into line and followed the example of Fred, who took out a wafer and dipped it in the wine before transferring it to his mouth. The meeting broke up amid more and louder cries of hallelujah, in which the Pope joined, and with further manifestations that the Spirit was indeed moving amongst them. Fred was duly rewarded by being sent for by the Pope, who thanked him warmly for all the good work he was doing for the Church. Fred stayed on in Rome, where he acted for a time as the Vicar of Christ's press secretary. In the Church's calendar, 1 year in every 25 is declared to be a holy year. It is a time of special pilgrimages, when millions do penance to mark their adherence to the faith and to obtain what is called the Great Pardon. Throughout that time Rome is seething with visitors from every part of the world, and on the last occasion of a holy year being declared, in 1975, Pope Paul extended a welcome, couched in the terms of emancipated religion to the new generation who had come in search of a liberating and inspiring aid, in search of a new word, a new ideal. Those who attended High Mass in St. Peter's on May the 19th, halfway through Holy Year, in expectation of those spiritual advantages, were in no way disappointed. They numbered some 10,000. Cardinal Swinens officiated at the high altar. Pope Paul was present. 500 priests were ranged about them. This is how an experienced Catholic journalist described what happened. When the time came to receive Holy Communion, it was not uncommon to see what one first thought of as white petals being scattered among the congregation. Only when I could push my way nearer did I realize that they were handfuls of consecrated hosts, that the cardinal's hench priests were scattering among the crowd. They fell on the shoulders of men, on the dyed and coverless heads of women, and as was inevitable, not a few fell on the ground and were trampled upon by the crowd. I spoke to a lady standing near me who was gobbling a number of them together. I asked her where she came from and was she a Catholic. She came from Egypt, she replied, and in fact had no religious persuasion, but her feelings were in favor of Mohammedanism. Tape recorders were held high above the assembly, that was fast being galvanized into a state of excitement. Suddenly a voice boomed out through a microphone placed near the altar that God was not only present but was now, in fact, actually speaking, albeit in a strong and nasal American accent. One wonders whether the ubiquitous Fred was in action again. Then Pope Paul took up the running. He gathered up handfuls of hosts, pressed them upon people whose mouths were already full of the consecrated species, so that they could only free their hands by passing the hosts on to others, who either crumpled them up or dropped them on the floor. The Pope, beginning to give an address, had to raise his voice in order to be heard above the growing turmoil, to which he added by exclaiming a further anachronistic Hallelujah, and flinging up his arms. By now some of the people were dancing. Others squatted or huddled on the floor among the trodden fragments of what, those same people had been taught, was the body of Christ. They swayed in time to a low moaning, an expression of the ecstasy inspired by the occasion, that grew in volume until it filled the basilica. Still in the same year, a visitor to the Church of St. Ignatius, in the street that bears the name of the founder of the Jesuits, in Rome, would have noticed that a heavy curtain was covering the main altar. Moreover, the seats had been turned round, as though to indicate that those who attended the service did not wish to be reminded of the lapis lazuli urn containing the relics of Saint Aloysius Gonzaga. A battery of microphones and loudspeakers was in evidence, and through one of these the voice of an Irish-American Jesuit, Father Francis Sullivan, was heard announcing, in the approved style of a follower of General Booth, that they had come together in order to praise the Lord. He went on to hammer home the fact that religion was in a state of flux, that everything was changing, and that it was a waste of time to take a nostalgic look back at things that used to be believed. His statements met with the smiling approval of Cardinal Swinens, who could always be relied on to put Roni's way out of fusions. By now the Romans were getting used to having their faith supervised by oracles from the states, and they listened attentively when a second voice, from the same place of origin as Father Sullivan's, exhorted them to love one another. People who were packing the church, thus encouraged, began to use their eyes, exchange looks, and to sidle alongside the person of their choice. Did they imagine, the voice went on, that the gift of love was a privilege intended for the early church only? Of course it wasn't. With that, cries of agreement nearly split the roof, and couples fell into each other's arms, sprawling on the floor, arms and legs flailing, fingers and mouths giving vent to a passion that was no longer fearsomely restrained by their surroundings, but which could now find expression in a freedom akin to that known to lovers in a ditch. Those who were barred, by age or infirmity, from taking part in the spectacle, savored it with a liquorish look, or danced a few steps, or sang the praises of the host whose house they had turned into a bedlam. Hallelujah! God was good, and all this showed that church-going could now be a joyous event. At the height of the uproar, a friar in the brown garb of Saint Francis of Assisi somehow managed to make himself heard. He was in dire physical straits, aware of a strange, mystical, and maternal sensation. He felt exactly as Mary had done when conceiving the Son. Full of grace. More applause. And hallelujah. Again. What was left of Saint Aloysius in his urn remained silent, as also did St. Ignatius who, as a soldier, had known the cleanly hiss of a sword as it was drawn from its scabbard. For the sake of providing a still more startling climax, let us look back to the year 1970, when a progressive theological congress was held in a Franciscan church in Brussels. The principal subject discussed, in flat contradiction of the Congress's program as indicated by its title, was sex, and it was expounded to an almost exclusively youthful gathering. It was rightly anticipated, because of the theme, that Cardinal Swinans would be present, apart from which, as Primate of Belgium, he was on his home ground. The Congress opened with the entry of girls, dressed in white and, as they twisted this way and that, waving cords and bits of broken chain to show that they were free. In an interval after the dancing, pieces of bread and glasses of wine were passed round, followed by grapes and cigarettes. Then, just as the young conference members thought all was over, their eyes were drawn towards the altar from which something was beginning to rise and to take on an unbelievable shape. It was at first greeted with gasps, then giggles, and finally pandemonium broke loose as the transparent plastic forming the shape was seen to represent a gigantic penis. The delegates screamed themselves hoarse, feeling that it was a challenge to a recognition of their virility. It was the sort of climax that had never been imagined and might only figure in the most extravagant of bawdy dreams. The presence of the cardinal gave a permissive glamour to a setting that they would never again regard with awe. It is well in place here, as part of our thesis, to look somewhat more closely at the scene that occurred in the Brussels church, and at the word hallelujah, which has never been in everyday use, as a spoken expression of praise, within the Seven Hills. As an offering of praise to Jehovah, it has always been commonly used by religious revivalists rather than by Latins. But now we find Pope Paul using it. What made him? And why did Cardinal Swinans, before an altar, preside over an amazing exhibition of carnal tomfoolery that many, especially the church-bound, will find difficult or impossible to believe? There is one explanation. Neither of those named, while wearing the robes, vestments, and all the outward signs of Catholic prelacy, were Christian men. They had passed, by preparatory stages, into the highest echelon of occult understanding. They had been tutored, signed for, and guaranteed by the masters of wisdom in one of the foremost temples where atavistic rites, all with sexual undertones, take the place of religion. When the adolescent girls shrieked with delighted embarrassment as the large plastic penis rose up before them, Cardinal Swinans knew perfectly well that they were, as he intended, commemorating the heathen god Baal, whose name, divided into its Sumerian root words, has several meanings. Among them, our Lord, Master, Possessor, or Husband, while others refer to a controlling male's penis with its forceful boring and thrusting. 128 So what the cardinal arranged for the young, mostly girls, of Brussels was a show of phallic worship, which symbolizes the generative power contained in the semen, or life juice, which streamed down upon all life and nature from the mighty penis of Baal. An exaggerated phallus was also a symbol of Yest, the sphere of the moon, and also of the horned god Dionysius, or Bacchus. The praise chant voiced by Pope Paul has its origin in the same fount of heathen worship, as its meaning, again according to its Sumerian construct, refers to the strong water of fecundity, or semen. During the public displays of mass sexual intercourse, which go by the name of fertility rites, this semen, when ejaculated, was caught in the hands of the officiating priests, who held it up for the approval of Yahweh, Jehovah, and then proceeded to smear it upon their bodies. So much was implied by Pope Paul when he raised his arms and uttered a heartfelt hallelujah.